Thank you, Aska, for the introduction. And I was saying that this is a very interesting sort of setup. There's people here in front of me in person in the ICA space, and then of course there's you amazing people who have joined in virtually. Thank you guys for your patience. I'm so sorry. It's like every bad joke about Zoom just happened. So yes, this is the field workshop in ICA. They're doing some amazing programming this month, and I am really, really excited to be here to talk about ableism over the next 2 days. Today, I think we're just going to jump right into it, but I wanted to let people know that I am monitoring the chat. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat, and you don't have to wait until the end, anything and then of course at the end, if people want to ask questions and unmute themselves and show their faces and everything through the digital realm, we'll definitely also be able to do that. Yeah, and then for the people here, there are some postcards that I made for the show on that table, and then if anyone who's joining virtually wants one, I can stick a stamp on it. Just let me know in the chat, and I'll email you or email me, and we can do that as well to sort of have the physicality, a little bit of that through the digital realm. But yeah, so I'm gonna start presenting, and let's just jump right into it. Today I'm going to be, let's wait until this goes full screen. So can everyone see my presentation mode just to check and still hear me? Yes? Okay, great. So this workshop, like Aska so nicely introduced, is called Filling the Void, Confronting Ableism in the Art Space. And I think the first goal that I sort of set out with when I prepared to do this workshop is that I was really coming from a personal place of feeling like there isn't a concerted, unified understanding of what ableism is for the public, for the mass sort of larger body, for the able-bodied individual, being able to answer the question, what is ableism? And so because I'm speaking specifically about ableism in the art space, it is important to me that we first lay sort of a foundation. So that's where we're going to start today. Because in order to take sort of realistic action to the problems and the issues that I'm going to be outlining here, which I will also address, of course, each person should be able to comfortably define what ableism is and what their role is in that. Ableism, of course, is an immensely complex subject, as all forms of prejudice are. But I think there is so much sort of silence and misinformation and miscommunication about this, and that really prevents people from understanding the true scope of ableism, or the ways in which ableism is functioning, and you may not even realize it. You may not even realize that you're being compliant with it. Like I said, there's no unified sort of language around disability right now, and I think, hopefully some of what we do today will make that possible. And this last sort of bullet point where I say that the elusive definition of ableism is something that I've struggled with myself. To be honest, even as a sick and disabled person myself, for a long time I was sort of experiencing ableism all around me and internalizing it, which again, it happens with all sorts of prejudices which marginalized bodies experience. But being able to transition from highly internalized ableism and sort of misunderstanding my own body's context because of that, to where I am now, where sort of I'm thinking about ableism all the time, thinking about it in the complex ways that it functions and how I can equip my own interaction with that in my work, and see that in the art space as well. So that's where we're starting off. Everything I just said, internalization, and I think that something that's really important to acknowledge is that the definitions that we have of ableism right now, especially for those who are able-bodied and are sort of trying to educate themselves and educate others around them, is that the definitions of ableism that people personally create for themselves are so linked to personal experience, to anecdotal experience that they are receiving from disabled individuals, ill/disabled individuals in their own lives, or that they are coming into contact with somehow. It's very difficult, I think, for a full body definition to be formed without anecdotal evidence or anecdotal pieces from disabled people who say, this is something specific that happened to me, this is ableism, like putting a label on it. And I think that, for me, I'm just going to give you the definition of ableism that I'm operating within, that I operate within in my own life, that I'm building upon constantly, that is always changing. But right now, I'm sort of identifying it as this like big network of beliefs and systems and practices, everything. Like it's that help to sort of put together and mold together the idealized body. You know, you can put quotation marks around body, right? But essentially, it's everything that contributes to us having a perfect norm of what a healthy human specimen is. Like I said here, consider the essential corporeal form, and that being directly linked to sort of being defined as like fully human, a real human, a true human, this sort of language. And that, you know, operates in all ways, but it's, you know, for me, speaking anecdotally, you know, in the medical complex, which I'm very much so entrenched within, the sort of binary of health that exists, which I'll touch on. But yeah, so it's important to understand that it's a sort of a two-part thing. So you have this ableist definition of what a real human, true human, perfect human is, and then that creates a parallel which traps the sick and the disabled into being inherently lesser, into being imperfect, and as I've said here, into being subhuman. And you know, just as giving simpler examples of that, I think it's if you examine in your own understanding of your own health and the way you're moving through the world, why sickness is inherently bad, why disability is inherently bad. So thinking of, you know, the connotations of the words good and bad being attached to healthy versus sick, and all of these things. Why, of course, you know, every aspect of our society that we live in, to use such a broad word, but, you know, the media we consume, the stories that we tell, everything, it operates in these really interesting ways. But yes, so that is the definition of ableism that I am operating within, and that we will be operating within for this, you know, programming and today. So now that we have the definition, you know, we can sort of start looking at structural implementations of this. And I, of course, like you guys know, I'm here to talk about the art space, the museum space, the gallery space, the critical space, so like what we're thinking about, what we're talking about, not always necessarily in relation to art, but here specifically, I think it's important to look at the art space. We are in a art institution, art space right now. Even through the virtual, we are in a critical art space together. So, you know, I again, all this motivation does come from a very personal place as an artist and as someone who visits museums and galleries frequently. I think it's really important to understand the museum as an institution. Of course, in the past few years, the past decade or so, we have had a really newfound power behind the critique of the institution and the museum as an institution, in terms of acknowledging colonialism, sort of like acknowledging whiteness within the museum, all of that. But it is such a valuable cultural space, and I think a lot of the thoughts that I have around ableism in the art space sort of hinge upon the fact that I really see the museum and the gallery and just the art realm as this sort of like microcosm, little concentration of the like representing and mirroring and also leading like the societal values of representation, of oppression, and all of these things. I think what you find in the museum very oftentimes is at the forefront of what is also happening in the society at large. And so the museum is such a valuable place because I think it's seen as still such a safe space, and it should be. Like, I believe with everything that I'm going to be talking about in today, in this little, you know, presentation that I'm doing, and everything that I'm talking about, it's important to me that I make it clear that the museum for me is, even though I will be talking about being ostracized, spaces feeling hostile, that as a cultural space, the museum to me is so important and is the reason sorry, there was I don't know if that picked up on the mic, but the reason that I'm giving this presentation and that I'm so passionate about this subject is because the museum means so much to me, the art space means so much to me, and I want to be able to contribute to its progression. Contextualizing ableism within the art space, though, it goes much farther than saying, here are structural things we need to fix in terms of physical access to the space, because that's sort of the ground layer of accessibility, is being able to have a disabled body in the space in a way in which it feels completely unimpeded, and beyond that, feels like they can move through the space and move through the space as freely as an able-bodied person can move through the space. And perhaps even more so if we're taking into consideration the disabled perspective in art making and in installation, and that I'll talk about a little bit today, but more tomorrow. But a big part of, you'll hear the term privilege when it comes to speaking about marginalization, of course, something we're all familiar with, the term, and acknowledging it and all of that. But able-bodied privilege is something that is difficult for individuals to acknowledge, and also very difficult, I think, for spaces to acknowledge without also feeling like there is, without the sort of hard admitting that you're being compliant in a system of ableism, because that is the truth of the matter. But able-bodied people, you need to be aware that you're moving through a space, you're moving through a world, not just the museum, not just the art space, but that is built for the able body to feel comfortable. And interestingly, in many ways, is built in a way that the able body feels comfortable while the disabled body is more impeded. Not just uncomfortable, but in fact, there are barriers to its access, which is what it means to live in an able-bodied world, where there are constructions and fabrications that specifically cater to the able-bodied experience. So talking again about the foundation that I'm trying to sort of build up here. The first thing, of course, is architecture, the physical construction of a space. And then there is the curation within the space. So I think that, the curator's role in the art space is something that is very important in terms of leading accessibility, because beyond the types of accessibility that come with, audio transcription, translation, ASL, elevators, ramps, all these very physical things. When you're curating an exhibit, the disabled perspective is so important to factor into that. And again, I'm going to elaborate on all of this, but when I say physical curation, I'm talking about, of course, the way that we engage with installations and the way that installations engage with the space around them. Identifying ableism within that, and saying how can we make a difference in this. Experiential curation, I'm talking about the immersion within the art, and this, for me, experiential curation, I also mean when we have pieces that are not purely visual, but also involve an audio component or a interactive component. How do we curate an experience that is accessible and that is not ableist? I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to that question, because I don't think an answer exists. I think that the basic thing that I want to say is there isn't a solution to ableism in the art space. I don't want to feel like I'm tricking anyone by saying, we're filling the void here in 2 days. That's not it. It's obviously there's never an easy answer, but I think that what I'm trying to talk about here is how do you begin following these modes of thought that allow you to understand the way in which the disabled perspective and the disabled body within the space is so vitally important to cast light upon. Accessibility, I put this in quotation marks because again, I'm talking about specific measures of accessibility that should be standard but aren't necessarily, and that means audio transcription, video transcription, sign language translation, the ways in which equity is provided within a museum and within a gallery, essentially is what I'm talking about. And if you go onto a museum's website, if not like independent galleries, like that's a very different thing, but largely funded spaces, MoCA, MoMA, things like that. If anyone has ever gone to look for accessibility features, it's bleak. Like, it's a bleak situation, and that's largely in part because there is no standardization across the board for how a space needs to operate and the things that it needs to have to provide for its patrons, its visitors, and all of this. Of course, places that are funded with larger sort of governmental backing, Smithsonian Institute, places like that, are much more articulated in the accessibility features that they provide on their website. Do they necessarily follow through on that? It's a person-by-person basis, but I think that you go to a space like MoCA here, and it's very difficult to find the accessibility page on their website. It's not an easy thing to find. So identifying things like that, where access starts not when you walk through the door of the museum, but long before that, when you are planning your trip to the museum, when you're thinking about how you will feel inside of the museum. Access isn't something that is physical, and I think that's another important point that I really want to drive home. Access starts when you feel emotionally like you can access a space, like you can access a work, when you can intellectually access a work, and then of course when you can, if you so please, physically access a work. And I think right now it's such a cool and important time to be talking about this. I'm talking to almost 30 people virtually, so thinking about what does access look like virtually, and I think certainly while the Zoom phenomenon or Google Meet phenomenon and everything provides a sort of excitable moment for accessibility, still, like, we need to do a lot of work because access it's so layered and it's so also highly individualized, and that sort of also fits into critical infrastructure. So I'm going to talk a lot about sort of thinking about the disabled perspective, CRIP perspective, and all of that. But now to sort of move into thinking about physical spaces specifically to start with. Again, just like I said, the ableism in terms of access to artworks, but I think it's also important now, participatory installations are a amazing rising sort of facet of the museum space, and I want to have people thinking about, and in their own experience within spaces, but also professionally, curatorially, all of those things, why we are operating under the standardized assumption that everyone who is entering the space has the ability to interact with that space. And I'm calling this the assumption of universal ability, which is assuming or not being sort of conscious about the fact that people are going to walk through the door and have a very different level of ability than you, and are not going to be able to interact with the space the same as you are going to leave that space, feeling very different than you. And I don't want to, I feel like a lot of the things that I'm going to say are very much so common sense when it comes to ableism, but I think the point is that because there's such a lack of concerted dialogue happening, you need to reiterate things that might seem like common sense, like not everyone has the same ability as you. I've had people in my life that I know personally that have come to that realization because they've known me and were sort of operating in their able body for their whole life without really having to think about the fact that they could climb stairs and never have to think about finding an elevator. Simple things like that. So now I'm going to be talking about specific spaces in Los Angeles and in New York. So East Coast, West Coast, showing love to both. But I think it's I not like a disclaimer or anything, but like a big portion of the second half of this talk is going to be focusing on what accountability is, and the importance of stripping away shame and building up language around accountability where it can actually lead to progress, because we are all compliant in the systems of ableism that function around us. We are built in an ableist world, so it is impossible to fully separate yourself from that. I am compliant in ableism in many ways, and there is no shame in that. So, like, I'll be talking about spaces that are, sorry if you're hearing that's picking up motorcycles, but I'm going to be talking about spaces that I love. I'm going to be talking about spaces and artists that I have a great deal of respect for, and I think that this is just all towards progress. So I'm starting with the Hammer projects, which happen at the Hammer Museum here in Los Angeles, where I am. And they have these amazing sort of rotating murals, for those who don't know, in the lobby of the space. And it's, I think maybe like 2 a year, 1.5 a year sort of thing. And I have two of my personal favorites here, by Leonardo Drew and by Yun-Hee Min. And I think I'm putting these here because this is just something that personally to me is such a good, simple, sort of foundational example of a barrier to experience. Like, you see here the Yun-Hee Min mural is on the stairs instead of on the wall. And so walking up these stairs, as if for anyone who has experienced it or just from seeing from the picture, is a beautiful, beautiful way to sort of engage with this mural in a very different way than usually we think about murals and all of that. But for both of these are two that I actually also included because these are two that I did not experience, because when I went to the Hammer and these were up, I was unable to climb the stairs. I had to take the elevator. So I think stairs are a really easy example because it's a sort of very tangible architectural facet where you can easily understand. I can see why there's people who would not be able to climb these and would have to take the elevator and would not be able to sort of experience the highly tactile nature of the Leonardo Drew mural or the immersive sort of walking on art feeling that you get from the Yun-Hee Min mural. And it's important to say, yes, I can navigate through the Hammer in terms of riding the elevator. That's just fine. But it's not the solution to this sort of barrier to access isn't to say, let's never have a mural installed on the Hammer lobby again, because stairs are something that are, really an important tool that I'll keep talking about, but solutions to ableism don't mean leveling the field in terms of creating space where it's equitable in that way. It's about saying, how do we begin dialogue with individuals who can't walk on top of the Yun-Hee Min artwork, whether that looks like installations with elevators, all of these things. I'm not here to give solutions to specific things that I've had barriers of access with, but it's changing the modality of thinking around discussion around art, around installation, around art, around immersion. So this is another piece from a show that was amazing, that they're closed in January here at MoCA, at the MoCA Geffen, which is in Little Tokyo here in Los Angeles. And this was a show called Foundation of the Museum from MoCA's collection. And this is a Chris Burden piece that, was first sort of created in '86 and then again for this show, and it's for anyone who got to see it, then I'm sure you understand, but it's a really incredible sort of experience walking through what is a very polished sort of white walled clean feeling museum like we all know, and finding this sort of like amazing upheaval in the main space of this polished area where you can dive beneath the surface of the museum, which of course is exactly the piece is executing its function in terms of this sort of reveal, this sort of tying everything together. This is another piece that I've included because I could not climb down the stairs and into this, and so you'll notice that like these pieces are ones that I've had personal experiences with, but I think again, not to keep using the trope of stairs, but you think about this incredibly powerful unifying action that this piece is enacting, and the viewer, the participatory element is so exciting. I share in that, of course. It's amazing to sort of interact with the space in such a new way, and I'm like begging for an acknowledgement of the disabled perspective, at least because it was so interesting for me as a viewer to not be able to descend these stairs, but to sort of sit and watch for a while, to spend time watching people interacting with this piece. And so this is a piece I wanted to include, because I'm not saying that none of these pieces are me or anyone saying that these works should not have been shown, absolutely not, and not saying that I had a negative experience with these pieces. Again, I'm saying that I had a completely different experience to that which the curator and the artist intended, and I, wanted to talk about it, of course, just like anyone else who interacted with this work. So you'll see that I'm going to keep coming back to this, like the need for not only acknowledging a perspective, but making a lot of space for it and saying, how do we critically bring into discussion the people who are not able to interact with this piece like we hoped for, intended for all of this. And so, that's where a really powerful discussion comes from, because, I would love to hear what the artist or the curator's thoughts are about people who are experiencing this secondhand. I had someone else who was with me and interact with the piece, and then they were like, oh yeah, it's really gnarly down there, and anything like that. So again, moving on to the next piece. So these are 3 pieces. These are a MoMA PS1, and then MoCA Grand, and then Hammer Museum. I'm sure many of you will recognize some of these works. This is an Ernesto Caviano piece, and I have, I think, another piece that's installed in the same stairway at MoMA PS1, which is in New York. Again, I'm sure some people are familiar with that space. And then this amazing installation that was at MoCA Grand with Lauren Halsey that I got to see several times, and then City 000 by Mike Kelly, which was, I have an installation shot from the Hammer Museum, but it was also at the Marciano when that was open. But these pieces for me represent, again, highly experiential, immersive pieces that I'm like, I see these works. I haven't, the Ernesto Caviano piece is one that I have not yet experienced. I think it's at the upcoming show at MoMA PS1, but it's this sort of like critical longing that I have, where I want to be able to engage in discourse with these works, as I know, and I'm sure that many ill and disabled people want to, contribute their perspective to this critically and just, conversationally as well. But the We Still Here There by Lauren Halsey was this sort of like, for those who didn't see it, it's this like rocky sort of installation with carpet on the ground, and there's all these nooks and really interesting things about black hair, about the black body, the black female experience, all of this installed amazingly with like mood lighting, really great immersive installation. And so when I was navigating the space, I had a lot of anxiety because I was using my cane, my like crutch, and it's like an interesting sort of tight space to navigate for bodies that can't sort of bend and twist and move through spaces like that. So and then of course, the Mike Kelly piece, as you can imagine, climbing these stairs. So I think as someone who is really interested in critically engaging with works, like it's very important to me, and so maybe not everyone in this call feels that same way, but I'm fascinated by the intention of the artist in the way that the installation, what the intention of the curators, all these things together that come together for creating an experience for the art viewer, which is something we can all understand. So when you think about what symbolism people are enacting when using stairs within a piece, because it's such a immediately powerful tool, right? Having someone climb stairs to look at something, it's immensely powerful, and we all understand connotations of power, connotations of, access, for the able-bodied, all of these things. And so, like, is it not, there's just this untapped sort of below that layer of what all of those intentions, all of those metaphors and artistic intentions and all of that mean when refracted through the disabled perspective, because it adds an immensely vital and complex critical discourse, because, you know, all of these pieces that I've shown share something in common, which is they're asking the viewer to be present within their own body consciously, while also within these spaces that have been created for them. And, you know, just like any sort of marginalized body, that presence within your body, within the space, it carries so much in terms of personal experience, in terms of, and then of course that personal experience being refracted and reflected in society at large. And we are of course talking about the disabled body, which is a body that is erased, which has violence enacted on it, which is silenced, which is oppressed. So you know, a lot of these pieces, again, that I've shown are talking about oppression, are talking about erasure, are talking about hierarchies that exist that we're all engaging in. And by putting the viewer into these situations, the viewer is able to say, I've experienced sort of this like concentrated version of what the artist is speaking to, which is an amazing tool. And so what I'm begging for and what I'm pushing for and what I'm hoping to educate on in all of this is saying how necessary it is to hear the disabled voice, not just to hear it, but to amplify it in these situations. I'll just quickly sort of go through these again. This is a Cecily Brown piece installed at MoMA PS1, sort of really taking over the space, drawing on the walls, extremely tactile, beautiful work. And then the Stair Procession by William Kentridge, also at MoMA PS1. MoMA PS1 loves to use staircases. I love it. I think it's you know, immensely powerful. It's an excellent installation tool. But again, thinking about what I'm asking for when it comes to curatorial consciousness, it's like, how do we begin to make space for understanding what the heavy connotations of this curation are, what it means to curate something in a space, and imbuing the knowledge that you are creating a space which a vast large number of people won't have access to. And as with everything that happens in art and installation, it should not deter it from happening. It should really only fuel discourse, because it's ripe for discussion. This is an amazing piece by Ernesto Neto, Nevadenga at MoMA, which was like this, you know, you climb in there. It's very tactile, very experiential. Again, just another example of just planting the seed of the vast range of bodies that exist in the world, many of which, invisible, cannot interact with these pieces in the way they are intended. And so I'm asking, why aren't we thinking about that more? Why aren't we talking about that more on everyone's part? Not just the artists, not just the museums, not just the curators, not just the passerby, all of these things. And of course, I've done a lot of work myself in raising this consciousness within myself, where I was speaking about sort of internalized ableism at the beginning, but essentially what that means is like when I am and was navigating through spaces and there were barriers to my experience and barriers to my access, and I was like this, and I took it as a completely normal and understandable thing. I was like, oh, well, you know, it's essentially, you know, saying, oh, well, of course I understand that I won't be able to experience this piece because I can't climb stairs, and that's okay, and nothing else needs to be said about it, when in fact that is a very, very highly necessary thing to talk about. Again, all of these examples that I've provided have been from, you know, major institutions that have an extreme amount of power, as the institution does hold. And so it's been important to me to include these examples, because I'm going to talk about a cycle that happens, where I mentioned how the museum participates in and sets the standards for representation and for inclusion. And so it's these pieces that I've included from these major institutions where it's so important to be critical and aware, because this is setting a standard. It's not just a disabled person won't be able to climb the staircase at MoMA PS1. It's what is that, not acknowledging that inaccessibility, what precedent is that setting, and like what is that functioning as in society when we are setting this as a norm, as something that is okay to not acknowledge all of these things. So it's not just about, one person being bummed because they can't climb a flight of stairs and see this amazing immersive installation, but it's about when that person leaves the museum, the ableism that is enacted on them being influenced and perpetuated by every sort of institution that they're interacting with and pinpointing these specific things. It's too many things to talk about if you want to pinpoint all the places where ableism is happening, but the museum is important, and so that's why I'm so impassioned about talking about MoMA, MoCA, Hammer, all of these places that are important to me as well, personally. So something that I've been putting a lot of thought to recently has been sound and video transcription, because I think it's interesting to become aware as a viewer of art, as a visitor to the art space, what it's like when you're interacting with a video piece or a sound piece or a sort of multimedia installation that might have all of these things, visual and sound, and what it means to transcribe that experience for someone who is hard of hearing or deaf or visually impaired or blind, because it becomes like so like existential almost, and very like heavy to think about the task of taking a piece of artwork that was created to be heard and putting it into a visual representation, whether that's text or something else, who knows. But I think that there is absolutely not enough discussion happening around video transcription and audio transcription, because why do we put so much emphasis on medium and art and experience of that in the way that it's intended, right? Again, coming back to the way things are intended to be. But who is being tasked with transcribing a immensely heavy or whatever transcendental sort of artwork into a completely different format? Does that responsibility fall to the artist? Does that responsibility fall to the space that is housing the piece, to the curator, to all these things? Certainly, it doesn't fall to the person who's experiencing the work to figure out how they should be interacting with it. That is what I believe. I think that these are the discussions that need to be happening. And I mean, again, this has been on my mind because I've been, doing transcriptions of my own video pieces, and I come to these moments where I'm like, I have to really be intentional about the words that I use to describe this visual moment, because if you are unable, again, this is when it comes back to sort of anecdotal experience in terms of framing ableism, but it's like you will not be able to understand what the experience of a blind person is watching a video piece ever, because that will not ever be able to experience you'll be able to understand unless you are blind and interacting with that video piece. So the immense amount of nuance and complexity that comes in, and subjectivity that comes into creating a visual language or an auditory language or a text-based language to make work truly accessible, it's an immensely complicated thing. And again, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer to this, but I certainly think that the artist, I'll share my personal opinion. I believe that the artist should play a leading role in that, because it falls first to the artist in the creation of the work, in the fabrication, all this crafting their intention, and then of course you put the artwork out into space. We don't have to start talking about what the relationship the viewer plays to the artwork, but certainly it's time for there to be a much more serious fostering of awareness around the accessibility of artwork. And I think that right now there isn't like, when an artist doesn't create a video transcription of their piece when they're delivering it to an institution, no one is examining the intentionality behind that, because it's a powerful thing to say, I'm actually not going to create an audio transcription. Someone else can do that. It's like, well, okay, there isn't an examination of that intentionality. There isn't due intentionality being assigned to that. So that is something that has been on my mind that I wanted to share, and something that I'll continue to be thinking about for a very long time. I think forever. And so now I mentioned this sort of cycle that I want to point out, and I have it here. It's where it's this othering of the disabled body in the physical space of the museum, whether that's in inaccessibility, whether that's in inadequate forms of translation and access and all of that. And that leading directly into sort of the lack of representation of disabled artists and art in subject in terms of the works, but also as the artists being represented, being housed, being seen within the art space. And so that's sort of like a mini cycle that's happening where it's like the feedback of disabled bodies feeling othered within the space, and then disabled bodies not appearing in the artworks within the space. But then that, like I said, because I think, the museum is such a facet, such a cultural space, that feeds into the sort of alienation of disabled bodies in society at large. And I'll mention some concrete examples of ableism in infrastructure and legislature and all of that, but it is this sort of feedback loop where of thinking about, I love the term othered, I love thinking about the othered body, but where identifying the vital role that the museum plays in that, and that's sort of what all of this is about, is that. So here's a little graphic that I made, a little diagram. And it is this sort of, I'm calling it this sort of closed loop of ableism. Again, so you see, we can start anywhere, but lack of full standardized accessibility in art space, leading directly to sort of the physical exclusion of the sick and disabled individuals from the art space. And, it's not like, it's very nuanced. Again, I want to point out, it's not like, as simple as, I can't climb up the stairs so I can't get into the museum, but it is that sort of heavy feeling, which I relate to, where you are excited to go to a space, to interact with the space, but there's also this anxiety of, oh God, how am I gonna navigate through this space? The burden of that navigation falling onto the ill and disabled person is immensely exclusionary, and it does create sort of hostility within the space. And so that all leading to sort of intellectual exclusion and critical exclusion, where it's like, how are you going to be participating in this dialogue, in this intellectual exchange, in this cultural exchange, all of these things, when you feel trepidation when entering the space, or you feel like the space is not catering to you, is not fully accessible to you. You're having to jump through hoops or not jump through hoops at all to get just access to something that is being set up for the able-bodied. And all of that finishing and starting over again, really, with the lack of sick and disabled representation in artwork, like I said. So it's all related, it's all interconnected. But so now we're going to move on to what I mentioned, this sort of fear of accountability. And this is a difficult, it was hard for me to synthesize my thoughts on this for this 2-hour event, because we're living through something right now that is immensely, it's weighing on all of us. I think if you're in Los Angeles, no matter where you are, it's such a politically exhausting time right now. And also we are witnessing the Black Lives Matter movement. We are participating in this movement, and you see these really unified calls for accountability happening right now. I mean, as has been happening for so long, but I think 2020 we're experiencing this collective sort of shit show happening right now, and it's this term accountability is coming up really importantly right now. And so I wanted to speak on it in the context of ableism, because it's something personally that I know is very difficult for people to sort of face and confront in a real progressive way. And so when I gave that sort of disclaimer before I delved into the examples from museums and everything, where I was saying this is not me expressing anger, disappointment, or anything for the Hammer Museum. Even if I was, that's completely fine and an acceptable thing to do, to criticize these spaces. This is a criticism, but there needs to be this shedding of reluctance to engage in accountability, because you are you are entering it with the fear that you will face sort of like negative repercussions for admitting that you are engaging in able-bodied privilege, when really just, you know, not being able to enter into a space of accountability is preventing progress from happening, because you not taking accountability, me not taking accountability, they them not taking accountability, doesn't admonish the privilege that you're experiencing. It just normalizes the sort of making it sort of secret, or like making it something that is undiscussed and has no need to be discussed. So a big part of that is not something that can happen in 2 hours, not something that can happen over 2 days. It's something that requires constant introspective thought on, is the unpacking of shame, and sort of thinking about shame and the role that shame plays in these systems of prejudice. But specifically, of course, I'll be talking about shame around disability and around looking at disability, around engaging with disability, and, you know, shame on the part of the able-bodied individual is a complex thing. I'm not going to delve into, you know, how I think a lot of the trepidation and shame around engaging with seeing, making space for the able body comes from internalized ableism that the able-bodied quote unquote healthy person engages in, where there's all this fear and disgust around disability that is written in us from the day that we are born. But what does it look like to unpack shame and to say, it's hard for me to look at this as an able-bodied person. It's hard for me to acknowledge this. It's something I would rather not think about, because that is a reality. That, you know, it's not a pleasant thing to admit the roles that we all play in these systems. And I think that it's better to do it together than to do it alone, certainly. So I'm hoping that, you know, I can in some way contribute to people feeling like they're equipped with better language to do it, with better consciousness, awareness to do it. But there's also an immense amount of shame within the ill and disabled person. And of course, I can speak to this very personally, but it is thinking about the heaviness of ableism around you and sort of existing within this system that is built to ostracize you, to make you feel guilty for the body that you're in, to make you feel ashamed of the body that you're in, and, you know, scrounging and searching desperately for the ability to speak up against it. And then when you find that ability, looking for language that people can actually understand and engage and critically engage with you with, which is, you know, again, why I'm doing this, but also why I think the best thing to do is to talk about it incessantly, which I do. And because there isn't an easy solution. There isn't some one thing that I or anyone else can tell you, any disabled person can tell you, that will change the way that you engage with the world around you as an able-bodied person. That is something that is truly deeply complex. And I think that the easiest and best way to personally contribute to that is, of course, breaking it down into what I'm doing here and now, talking about art, talking about the museum, talking about these things that I'm so personally vested in. But admitting the way that we participate and the way that we have participated in the past and will continue forever to participate in these structures, you know, forever being like, you know, for the rest of your lifetime, is vital. And I think, again, coming back to this, you know, I'm so happy to be doing this with ICA, because it's like a space that I love and I adore, but also that sort of the idea of change happening from within, and, you know, a community of people who are already dedicated to sort of engaging with it and educating themselves and educating others. Like, that all starts in this way, and branching out into the people that are, you know, undereducated about this. But the museum plays a huge role. And again, I say museum, I also mean gallery, I also mean art space, but like we're saying, capital M museum, institution museum, plays a huge role in this, like for all the reasons that I've said. But it's up to us as the individuals, it's up to us as critical people within the space to say, I'm not ashamed to take accountability in this. I'm not ashamed to talk about my ability to engage with this art being so different from the person next to me and all of that, because able-bodied privilege is something that has existed for forever and will, you know, exist for a very, very long time. And so it's something that's always been there. It's just how much light are we going to shed on it. And the slide, talking about sort of synthesizing what I've been saying, but solutions to this extremely prevailing issue within the art space, it's not as simple as just stopping curating within stairwells and all of the, or like completely ceasing the curation of pieces that are immersive, of pieces that rely on an able body to interact with them to execute the artist's intention, because the pieces that we looked like, that is what they are relying on. It's about taking away the negative connotations of saying that is an ableist piece of artwork, because you could say that about a great many amazing, influential, highly necessary pieces of artwork, and that does not detract from their need and from their validity, of course, and from the amount of discourse that should be happening with them. That's the thing. It's the solution to this problem that I'm pointing out does not involve the detracting of any perspective or the detracting of any one artist or any one institution from this whole cultural discussion. It's about saying that there is never going to be a limited amount of space for the perspectives that we are including, so why are we not including the disabled perspective? I think it's again, like I said, it's not a question of how can we just get a disabled person in here? Can this disabled person navigate through the space? Great. It's like, why is this an afterthought? Why are accessibility measures things that happen as the last step in a curation in a museum? Why is it the sort of like everything is set and then now we figure out how do we make this as accessible as possible? It's about saying this is one of the first steps that should be at least considered. And again, I'm not saying that every single artist, every single space needs to be changing the way that they, allocate funds or allocate thought to accessibility, but at least saying that, hey, it's a really intentional thing when you choose not to subtitle your work, and that is important. So it's that shift in dialogue, and I'll keep repeating this again and again because it's, bouncing around in my brain. But I think an example of a picture that I didn't include is that there has been some really amazing sort of elevator installations, thinking about when you put in accessibility measures or within spaces that are meant solely for the purpose of accessibility, what does it look like to curate with only those spaces in mind, or not adapting pieces to exist there, but using that as a space of accessibility? It's a really, there's nothing that can happen but progress, because it's just sort of like such an untapped, amazing space, I think. And then, now I think it's important to talk about the disabled perspective. And again, tomorrow I'll be talking about my own practice. I'll be talking about the practice of artists that have really been influential for me personally, and really sort of honing in on this idea of the disabled perspective. But what I've been sort of alluding to this whole time, and what I've been sort of coming back to this whole time, is that need for the disabled perspective. And what I mean is not just a disabled person saying, this is my experience of the piece for you to understand, for you to engage with, here it is from the mouth of the horse or whatever, to use as you please to engage with this artwork. It's about the able-bodied person being able to, as closely as they can, equip the disabled perspective in a space to critically engage with it and say, I understand my existence in this space, but I also understand that there's a radical shift in context of this space that I'm in for a person whose body is completely different from mine. Or maybe not even completely different, but just different in one singular way. And I think like many of the works that have been done around the need for X perspective in examining film and examining art and examining society and examining language, it's not a tool that you can pick up and just say, I have this now, I have the disabled perspective. If it was that easy, my God, we wouldn't be here. But it's about educating yourself. It's about doing the work to engage with this. And, it's an immensely complicated thing, and I think it's an immensely fruitful and powerful thing. I personally, might be biased, but I think that the disabled perspective is really, really linked to, examining the way society functions, the way society treats its most marginalized members speaks volumes. And I think that for people to even be thinking about what they've never thought before is right now a radical act. And I think it shouldn't be, and I hope it isn't in the future, but certainly putting yourself as an able-bodied person in the perspective, in the space, to be considering the disabled body right now is a radical thing because of how immensely silenced and oppressed the disabled body is. So I think, asking why there's no this critical consideration that I've been talking about, why there's no critical consideration being taken for site-specific work, participatory pieces that are being viewed passively, like I said. The example I wrote out here that I mentioned, watching people ascend and descend stairs, watching people interact with works, and what that secondhand experience carries and what it speaks to. It's such a really powerful sort of what's the word that I'm looking for? Like watching people at the Mocha show climb up and down in the Chris Burden piece represents a universal sort of disabled experience of moving through the world, which is built for the able body, and watching it cater to able-bodied need, and sort of sitting there and being like, well, I can tell that this place wasn't built for me. So it's a powerful, succinct sort of representation of that happens in the museum, and that's it's like a gold mine, I think, and anyone can tap into it, is what I'm saying. I think this bold text, without necessary conscious acknowledgement and validation of the disabled perspective and experience, the art space is flattened. It's really being done an injustice, I think, by being inaccessible and by having this sort of hostility. And again, I'm saying the word hostility, thinking about an environment, thinking about what is safety, what is accommodation, what is the difference between feeling like you are welcomed in a space, you are safe in a space, the space is accepting you, holding room for you, and then what is the difference between that, which is a very important and necessary feeling, and feeling like you are doing the work to exist in that space, and it's exhausting, and doing the work also acknowledging that there's much of that space that you are never going to be able to access. And I say space loosely because I am talking about walking through the doors of a museum, but I'm also talking about all of the discourse that is happening around artwork that becomes highly inaccessible because of what's happening in the physical space. So, I've been saying I'm begging for dimensionality, but that's what all this sort of comes down to: dimensionality, representation, perspective. So yeah, this is another sort of image that I've made. I think we have the immense privilege right now, everyone that's here, I believe, of living in the United States. And I say that as a person that is, very critical of this country, not a patriot, any of that. But I mean that in the sense that we are living in the Western world, and that's a tool. That is a invaluable asset to our criticality that we need to pay attention to, because when I'm speaking about the museum, I'm speaking about the art space, and speaking about all of that, I'm of course coming at it from a highly critical perspective of the canon and the colonial roots of the art world that we function in right now. But existing in sort of the midst of all of that, we need to sort of make it into a tool. I was going to say weaponize, but I don't want to use that term. But we need to take the situation that we're in right now, and understand that there are so few barriers to exploding our levels of criticality, our levels of engagement, our levels of interdisciplinary connection and discourse and understanding and all of that. It is simply about saying the first steps really that we need to take that aren't even fully being taken now are turning to disabled bodies and sick bodies and just saying, what is your experience of this space? Because it is clearly radically different than everyone else's. Even if it's not radically different, slightly different. It's just about asking for that, because there is no shortage of people who have perspectives to provide. I think, again, I chose to frame this in the sort of artistic context because that is my reality. That's the space that I'm living in physically and mentally all the time. But I hope that I was able to sort of make it clear that you can look at what's happening in the museum and you can apply that so like frighteningly easily to what's happening in any sort of situation. I'll touch on this again tomorrow, but sort of two examples that are really important to me to bring up about ableism and sort of the reach of ableism, understanding that you can examine it on so many levels. You can dig in super specifically and examine all the ways that the Smithsonian, for example, has been ableist since its creation. But you can also step back, which is important, outside of the museum and say, why is it that last year the city of Los Angeles was sued for creating low-income housing that was inaccessible, fundamentally inaccessible, and the fact that they faced a lawsuit for that and had to sort of answer for creating an inaccessible space that was with funds that were allocated in the hopes of accessibility, not just for disabled people, but for across class and all of that. What we need is the ability to go from the micro to the macro, to say that I am experiencing this ableism here, I am seeing this here, and it's connecting to me the language that we have around disability and illness everywhere else. It's truly like a web. It's like an ever-changing, three-dimensional ball of yarn that's all tangled up and connected. I think I have a lot of thoughts about language too. I think that when I keep saying that it's important to me to introduce language, or at least foster language around illness and disability and criticality that is not ableist, is because the language that we default to is ableist language. And you think about ableism in metaphor, you think about blindness as a metaphor, the way blindness is used in criticality. You think about the word cripple, you think about the ways in which it's built into our language to connote illness with the bad, with disability with the bad, and using that in metaphor, using that in all these ways. So I mean, like, these are all like, I'm just trying to give you a perspective of like what's happening in my brain when I'm talking about the museum. It's like I'm also talking about books, the way books equip language, the way books equip ableism, all these way, movies, TV, everywhere, ableism everywhere. That is what I'm trying to say.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to ICALA's Field Workshop Program. We have a series called the Field Workshop Action Projects, which are a series of programs. They're either public-facing or not, but they are the result of a collaboration between the museum and artists to use our space while it is not being used for our regular programming, because our regular programming has been sidelined for the moment since March. We've been closed to the public, but however, during this month of August and in the beginning of September, we are sharing our space and sharing ideas and incubating and encouraging the development of projects that are encouraging our momentum, to keep up the momentum for change. And today we have Filling the Void, Confronting Ableism in the Art Space with Panteha Abareshi. This is a two-part program. This is part 2. And if you've missed yesterday's program, we will be providing the recordings of these programs for you after today. We do want to state that these are recorded, and that if you are not comfortable with your image or your video of your space on the video. Certainly please hide your profile for this session. The internet has been behaving strangely, so if I get cut off, I'm going to try to breeze through my introduction now, and hopefully it just keeps going. But should it come off, don't worry, we're either just hang in there, or you might need to log out, hopefully not. This is an incredible program, very important topic. Art spaces were addressed yesterday, ableism in the art space, and that will be continued today, and also an examination of artists' work. This is going to start with a beautiful presentation by Panteha, and then engagement with all of you with question and answers. So thank you so much for coming. The museum is planning to open fall exhibitions on September 26th with the artists Howard Mendez and Scott Khan. So stay tuned and keep following what we're doing. And thank you so much for being part of today's program. Take it away.
Yesterday, I began this one-part program, and I spoke about sort of the art space and everything there. And today I'm going to be continuing, like Aska said, but I'm going to be also talking about disability in practice and embodied illness. We'll get into all of that. But I was saying yesterday, I really do encourage people to use the chat if you're virtually, and also like if you're here in person in the space in ICALA, to like raise your hand, or just like if you have something to say, please. I understand, like, I am someone that I just talk and talk and talk, and I, don't take a breath because I'm very impassioned, but a big part of this is answering questions and engaging with people, and if you have anything to contribute, even if it's not a question, even if you just have something to say, let me know. And this time I will be sort of trying to hold more space and pauses for people to ask questions or say anything if they do, so don't let your virtual participation in this preclude you from feeling so inclined as well. So let's dive into it. I'm going to present my screen. And yes. Oh, I think it's okay. I'm presenting. So all right. So welcome back to, like Aska introduced, Filling the Void. I'm really happy to be here at the ICALA space. Just to recap what we talked about yesterday, I went sort of in depth into integration of ableism within the art space, and I gave some examples from Los Angeles and New York, from MoMA PS1, from MoMA, from MoCA, and from the Hammer Museum. I spoke a lot about sort of what accountability means and the need for it, but all of that sort of stemming from discussion and engagement in that way. I also spoke about the cycle of exclusion, which I had like a diagram that I don't have in this presentation, but that I'm gonna share all of these materials for those who are interested. But my sort of crux of what I was talking about yesterday was the fact that ableism within the art space, which is what we're here to talk about, within the museum space, within the gallery, is directly linked to all forms of ableism in the world around us. And there is no delineation, there is no compartmentalization, really. And, as an art maker, as an artist, and as someone who is engaging in the art world as well, like that is the platform that I jump off of because it's so linked to my own personal experience. But the museum as a cultural space is super important. And I talked about a little bit about the disabled perspective, but that's what I'm here to talk about today, to go into more, and then building language around the disabled experience. So that was yesterday. Let's begin. It's a new day. So today I'm going to be talking about disability in practice, and it's so important to keep reiterating the fact that ableism really relies on societal structures that cater to the able body, and it's a difficult point to sort of to really understand fully, I think, without, again, the sort of anecdotal evidence or accounts from disabled people that but understanding that there's a difference between living in a world where there aren't proper accessibility measures for the disabled body versus living in a world that's actually built to preclude the disabled body from even feeling comfortable. So it's like a difference between like an equitable world and a world that is, completely filled with barriers against existence. And a lot of, that ties into, from structural practices to language to all these things, to the ostracizing the disabled body. This isn't the right place because I'm here to speak about, the art space specifically and art practice, but language around illness is something that I think a lot about, talk a lot about, and I just want to sort of bring it up slightly here today, and I'll continue sort of bringing it up through the presentation, but becoming aware of ableism integrated into the most basic forms of our communication as well. The metaphors that we are drawn to using, the tropes in films, the way the disabled image is used as a derogatory, negative connotation, as a metaphor for larger catastrophic things. There's no separation in our comfortable figurative language between illness and badness, wrongness, all of these things. It's a very easy sort of metaphorical device for reasons which tie into, of course, the connotation of disability and sickness as disgusting, abhorrent, all of these things. And as someone who is, so entrenched in like the hospital system, the medical system, I'm also seeing the way that ableism is integrated into the systems of health, which you would think would be probably ideally the safest places for sick and disabled bodies, but it's really, I'm having someone shaking their head no in the audience who, it's actually such an ostracizing space because the Western medical complex is built upon the same standards of ableism that I'm talking about in the museum, that I'm talking about in language. And again, I have to like prevent myself from going off on a tangent, but if you think about the way pharmaceuticals are marketed, if you think about the way health as like a holistic practice is marketed, in the capitalist structure that we live in, it's really based upon the denigration of anything that is not healthy, and that standard of health is unachievable for anyone who is able-bodied or otherwise, but it really traps the disabled body into this awful box. And so that kind of gives birth to taboos that we have around the disabled body as well, and how it moves through space. And the sort of discomfort that there is around disability and illness, and talking about it and pinpointing it and examining it, partially because rightfully so, there's a lack of education that also people don't want to be offensive and people don't want to cross boundaries, which is excellent. But on the other hand as well, there is a sort of deeply rooted thing, I would argue, within all of us, which has prevented us from developing the right set of tools to confront disability as a part of society that is not shameful, should not be covered up, should be celebrated, should be examined, should be, documented. Like the concept of a disabled history is still such an underground thing. It's super DIY. Like if you think of all the amazing monumental movements for equity that have happened, they've all started super DIY and with people who are looking for it for themselves, wanting to just create that space. And I think that is definitely happening. It's been happening for a long time. I mentioned super briefly crib theory yesterday. I feel like I should probably have elaborated on that more instead of just throwing that term out there and then moving on from it. But crib theory is essentially, in brief, the sort of movement around disability, acceptance, imaging, documentation, theorizing around illness philosophically, which is something that has only ever been done by able-bodied people or people coming from a sort of Western medical perspective. And if you examine illness within philosophy, you will find a lot of metaphor around illness being used negatively. So crib theory also really involves the embrace of the disabled body as something that doesn't need to be fixed, something that doesn't need to strive for a standard of health that is being defined by other people. And that is something that really resonates with me personally, the idea that the sick body is not something that needs to be replaced or fixed or in any way, using the term fix, heal, in all of that. So crib theory, that's sort of what's at the crux of it. But again, it's not something that's educated on. If you want to find information about it, it's mostly anecdotal again. So anecdotal histories build the foundations of all new movements, and that's the stage that we're in right now, I think. So that's what I'm trying to confront today. So moving on. Like I said, societally, I think we're taking a lot of subconscious cues from art, and I think that has, especially in the Western canon, that's the frame that we're operating within, unfortunately, today. But, thinking about how society is mirroring what's happening in art, and art being at the forefront in many ways of representation, radicalization, but also because we are operating within an artistic world and system that is, is not outside of the capitalist status quo. There's this interesting dynamic where the art world is both mirroring what is happening in society and setting a new precedent. So it's a really vital space for me. That's why I think I'm so sort of passionate about accessibility within the art space as well, because you can make a lot of change from within the art space, but you can also cement in a lot of prejudice within the art space. The systems that we're operating in do rely on this alienation, and you see that within the museum. You sort of you think about the museum as an institution, as a colonially rooted institution, and you understand that alienation is a big part of how the museum has become such a powerful institution, because it relies on the othering of bodies and the uplifting of other bodies. If you're talking about whiteness, if you're talking about cisness, if you're talking about able-bodiedness, you see all of these things. So when we're focusing specifically on the disabled body as we are today, I think so much relies on just fundamentally understanding how the disabled body is seen as lesser and treated as lesser, and how you are made to feel like you should be hiding away your body if it is not adhering to the able-bodied standard. I spoke yesterday about internalization of ableism, and how, from a personal perspective, feeling like I need to train myself to appear more able-bodied than I actually am, to move through the world, and then later on breaking away from that. But thinking about that, sort of how a body is presenting, is really significant within the museum, because it reflects the experience of the viewer, ties into the experience of artwork. And again, not a tangent that I want to go down, the relationship between viewer and artwork, but yes. So, finding that reflection within the space, it really hinges on this critical discourse that I'm advocating for yesterday and then more today. So that brings us to sort of this term that I use, and I've been using a lot more and more, which is embodied illness, and thinking about within an art practice specifically, the vital need for disabled artists sharing the disabled perspective. I think this idea of embodying illness is so important, because it is putting illness to the front and representing it in ways that are breaking away from what is expected, and the able-bodied box that is put around the representation of the disabled body, because you can have representation of disability that is 100% ableist in its representations. And you think about in the past 10 years, what films you have seen in which the protagonist or an adjacent person in the film is disabled, and it is bleak, it is grim, and the narrative around disability that we are accustomed to in the media is one that relies on the disabled body doing everything that they can in their power to not be disabled anymore, or not be seen as disabled anymore, or finally live the life of an able-bodied person. And that is 100% reflected in the narrative of illness within the museum. So artists who are embodying their own illness and their own disability in their work are extremely important. And of course, I'm biased because I am a disabled artist who is embodying my own illness in my work. But when I see that and when I find that in other artists and within the museum space, it is so personally liberating and overwhelming in a really positive way. So here in my bold font that I love, I put that the importance of discomfort, because that is an important part of the relationship between the disabled body and the society at large, is this idea of discomfort. Discomfort on the part of the disabled body, but largely on the discomfort on the part of the able-bodied, society that is viewing them, that is framing them, and that is dictating their narrative. And I think that a huge part of making a difference in the representation of disability in the art space is embracing just the need for discomfort, because I believe that progress comes from the uncomfortable, and right now disability is such an uncomfortable thing, and it's going to remain in that stagnant place unless we break into a place where we are understanding that to move forward we need to be uncomfortable and have this discomfort. So I'm going to be talking about three, four artists that have been extremely personally influential to me, who are, as I have coined, embodying illness. And the first is Jessie Darling, who is a UK-based artist who is doing these amazing sort of sculptural works. And yesterday I talked about museum spaces and art pieces that I have personally struggled with. And again, it's important to understand that accountability doesn't mean shame, doesn't mean admonishment or anything, but I did feel that it was important to balance that out by saying there is amazing work happening right now, and one of the people doing on the forefront of that, I believe, is Jessie Darling. They make these amazing sculptural installations that embody like the wounded figure, and it's interesting because you won't find very many actual human anatomical representations in their artwork. It's very object-based, and I think it resonates deeply with literal objectification, but also thinking about how broken pieces exist within a space as a reflection of health, as a reflection of pain, sorrow, and touching on the ideas of empathy and care that are really important when thinking about illness and how a disabled person moves through the world. There's a lot of tenderness in Jessie Darling's work, which I think is very important, and I think the next few artists that I'm going to show work in a lot of self-portraiture, a lot of self-documentation. Jessie Darling's work is interesting to me because there's not, images of the artist's own visage in the work. Instead, it is referential and representational of an experience through really honed sort of object pieces that are away from the anatomical, away from the human face and all of that. So if you haven't heard of Jessie Darling, now you have. But if you know of their practice, they've been in the Venice Biennale and have shown amazing extensively. So amazing disability representation in that way. But I think it's when you think about work that is on the forefront of representation, it's a complex subject to broach because one person might not read a piece as being referential to the disabled experience, and that is okay. It's not about seeing a work and understanding that that piece is talking about disability, that piece is talking about a broken body, a body in pain. It's about broaching the art space as sort of an unexplored terrain in terms of this sort of representation. This is Sue Austin, and this is a piece from 2012 in which she created this really fantastic underwater wheelchair and did this video piece, performative work underwater. And the entire piece is called Finding Freedom. This is a video, this is an excerpt from the video, and then 2 stills that were taken underwater. And I wanted to include this piece because I think, I'll be honest, it's extremely beautiful, and I think it's a very touching piece, but I think in practice, the idea of exploring the taboo space is really succinctly sort of represented in this work. I think it's really powerful, and Sue Austin also speaks very publicly about her own work, sort of in advocacy and education as well, which is, I think, a very important part of a practice of this nature. I just wanted to show this work because it is exactly sort of what I've been talking about, this embodied, beautiful embodied illness and disability, and to push to the forefront in this way and really, let's see. Oh, they can't. Oh, so you guys can't see. Sorry, I'm reading the chat. So can people see that? You guys can see? Okay. All right, so it's one person is struggling seeing the visuals, but everyone else is able to see them because I'm in presentation mode. Sorry, this is like a virtual, yeah, okay, sorry. So as I was saying, it's, oh my gosh. Sorry, let me just figure this out. Oh, whoa, skipping ahead. What's going on? What? Hi guys, sorry, can everyone, I'm not presenting anymore, so I'm gonna start presenting again. Can everyone hear me, just to check? Yes, okay, I'm gonna start presenting again. Let me know, hopefully it works this time for everyone. I'm so sorry. Sorry guys, this is like Zoom world, real world colliding. All right, can everyone see this? Sue Austin? Yes, awesome. Okay, yeah, it looks like everything's fixed. Sorry guys, okay, thank you for your patience. I was like, bridging the gap between the real and the virtual. But anyways, yeah, so this Sue Austin piece, just, you know, I think as an artist myself, you know, who's working in this realm and thinking about this constantly, it's really important that you are able to sort of access like a collection of resources around the things that I'm talking about. So, you know, in me presenting these artists to you guys, I'm both sort of sharing with you what has influenced me, but also, you know, this is a part of me collecting a sort of master list, master document of all of these things, so it's more accessible to people. Because I had a great question yesterday that was, you know, if I'm an able-bodied person and I want to think more about this and I want to, you know, see more about this, understand more about this, like where can I go to do that? And I didn't have an answer for that person because there isn't a place right now where you can go, you know, www.myablebodiedprivilege.com, you know, like that sounds super sick. I hope no one has that domain, but like, so I'm right now putting together like a huge Google Doc, and this is all part of it. This is going to be accessible to everyone, shared with everyone here, everyone in the virtual world. But sharing resources, I was explaining this yesterday, that because the sort of education on able-bodied privilege is so linked to the anecdotal and so hinged upon disabled people and sick people being generous enough to share their experiences to educate, I think for those who are willing to do that, generously willing to share that, there needs to be a place to sort of start collecting that, and no one is doing that right now. So, you know, I really firmly believe in not only speaking on my own practice, but also on the practices of those who are also doing this. On to the next. So these are going to be 3 stills from a video piece that I'm going to talk about. I just wanted to sort of show them full screen. This is Frank Moore, and this is VHS stills, which is why it looks like that quality. It's from the 80s, so these are 3 video stills, just sort of my favorite video stills that I selected, just going through them sort of quickly. But yes, this is Frank Moore, and this is from a video that really made a huge impact on me. From 1989, and this is available. This will be a part of the resources and everything, but this is available on, you know, the web archive. the full video for anyone to watch, for anyone to download. Frank Moore has very generously shared so much of his video work into the public domain for people to be able to access. But Frank Moore is he's not creating new work, I don't believe, but he is a visual artist, performance artist with cerebral palsy, who made this really amazing piece here that you're seeing stills from called Out of Isolation, which I think is a hilariously timely title for right now. But it is basically this piece of him sort of like, sexually, sensually, romantically interacting with this woman who is unnamed. And it's a, long piece. I think it sort of has 3 acts, and Moore is just naked through the entire thing on this bed, and it was so impactful to me because something I've been thinking about for so long without first without realizing it, but then sort of bringing a lot of consciousness to what I've been thinking about is the relationship between the disabled body and sensuality and sexuality, and the immense taboo that exists around the disabled body as a sexual thing, whether it's being sexually liberated or sexually repressed, or sexually manipulated, or put into positions of extreme discomfort. I think there's absolutely not enough education around illness and sexuality and disability, all of these things, and so this performative piece / hyper-personal documentational piece that Frank Moore made really captures a beautifully emotionally overwhelming moment of intimacy of the disabled body that I was so overwhelmed by because I'd never seen anything like it before, and I'd been thinking about it for so long, and it was one of those like aha moments where I watched it and I was like, oh my God, like this just captures like this intense emotion that I've been having so much trouble articulating for myself for so long. And again, I'll share the link to this. I encourage anyone and everyone to watch this in full. It's just super tender and it's like it's just extremely beautiful, and it's also what I was talking about. It's also quite uncomfortable too, and I think that that's so important because as I was having this sort of overwhelming emotional moment, I was also like, wow, like this is like I'm experiencing sort of like a discomfort that is really interesting as well. And it made me just want to like watch it more and talk about it more and sort of like dive into that. And I think, we're obviously operating within a world that is filled with sexual taboos, and we as a culture and as a species, I'd say, definitely don't have the right language to fully articulate ourselves as sexual beings, unfortunately, even though we've had a lot of time to sort of figure that out. But I think the fact that able-bodied people are struggling to articulate themselves as sexual beings, of course it makes so much sense that the disabled body has not even people are like, we can't even handle thinking about that right now because we're just trying to figure out our own deal, and sexual identity, of course, and sensual identity and romantic identity ties so specifically to the way we operate within the society that we're in, whether or not people want to talk about that or not. But the fact that you if I say like have you ever seen handicap porn? Like it's not like a comfortable subject because it's talking about pornography and sex, but it's also not a comfortable topic because, and I readily admit this, I don't have a frame of reference exactly for what the sexualized disabled body is, in the way that I have a very strong reference for what the sexualized able body is, because that is what you see in every form of media. So, when I talk about the need for this disabled body in the art space, even though this piece, Out of Isolation, was never shown in a gallery, it was never shown in a museum. In fact, Frank Moore's entire practice is quite unknown, and in the regions it is known, it's considered other art or fringe art, meaning that it is not readily curated into large museum spaces or is considered necessarily. It's an art that's considered taboo. It has had that label put on it, and the reason is because he is a disabled body that is, confronting these taboos very head on, which I think is amazing and really empowering. But so when I speak about these works and this need for representation, it's not just what is being hung on the white walls of the galleries that we are so accustomed to and that we feel so safe in, but it's also saying, how do we even begin to discuss work that is broaching these amazing areas of taboos? Like, how do we build up a language around that? And it's the same critical language that is applied within MoCA and MoMA and Hammer and ICALA as is applied to very personal discussions around the sexualized body, around the erased body, the violated body, the body that's having violence enacted on it. It's not, there is no hierarchies within the languages that we need to be using. We need to all individually also be developing a relationship to our able-bodiedness, your able-bodiedness, their able-bodiedness, all of that in a way that you can personally articulate it, because no one can articulate that for yourself. You have to figure it out. And so I thought I'd share these three artists because they really helped in my own relationship to my disability and my illness, and contextualizing myself and articulating my frustrations around all of these things. But one more artist I don't have a slide for, but is important to mention as well is Cherie Rose and Bob Flanagan. Bob Flanagan being the artist with cystic fibrosis, who did sort of sadomasochistic performance work with Cherie Rose. And I think, Bob Flanagan had a piece called Visiting Hours, where essentially he did this installation and was a hospital room that you could go and sit for as long as you want and sort of talk with Bob and be in that hospital setting. He's in a hospital gown and had his nasal cannula, which is like for oxygen and all of those things. And I think through all of these works, something that is really resoundingly felt is this emotion or this articulation around care and around how the viewer is not only relating to the artwork as a thing, but to the subject of the work, and the intimacy that exists there. Because, not for every disabled body, and certainly not for every sick body, but a big thing for me personally is thinking about what care means and what intimacy means with the disabled body in terms of a body that needs physical help and emotional help in ways that an able body doesn't, whether that's like hygiene or anything. Like, a body that is malfunctioning like my own, it's like I need help, and that frames intimacy in a very different way. So the through line of care, I think, is also something that's so important, and right now it is important for me to bring up, because I think that we just need, like, not to make a broad generalization, but I think we just need to hold so much more space for care of the bodies that are being ostracized, and also thinking about vulnerability and weakness and the prejudices that we have against that, not just in framing illness and disability, but, what is your own personal relationship to weakness, and how does that operate the way that you see others, vulnerability. I think asking for help is a sort of a through line as well through these works, or the concept of help, and all of those are such really powerful universal subjects that are concentrated so poignantly within work made by disabled artists. But it's something that everyone can relate to, again, which is why it's like I was saying yesterday, like the idea of integrating the disabled perspective is one that it's like amazing for everyone. There's no one that loses in that situation, because able-bodied people can relate in their own way. Everyone can relate in their own way to needing help, into feeling afraid, into feeling broken and ostracized and alone. And like, these are universal subjects that, like, it's not a disabled thing, it's a human thing to feel alone and to feel scared. But I think that a vital part of articulating the disabled perspective universally is encouraging everyone to develop a better relationship to their own body and their own fear and their own loneliness and all of that. So it's not just about carving a space for the disabled body. Like, that is vitally important as well, but it's like, for that to happen, we need a better emotional language generally, and of course again, bringing it back to art, because it explodes into this like huge thing if you are talking about the vital need for a better human emotional language. But bring it back so we can actually focus on something here. Within the museum, we're operating, again, I'll say it again, we're operating within an institution, and I think every person that is critical of that space is saying, where is the emotional intelligence when dealing with othered bodies? And that goes for Blackness, that goes for the body that is not conforming to the gender norms that we have, the cis norms that we have, and it pertains to disability, it pertains to all sort of othering and fetishization within the museum space, all of that. So, begging for more emotional intelligence in the way that we are also expanding our perspectives. So, going off of what I just talked about, the sort of universal fear, fragility, all of that, this is again something that I don't want to like let myself dive into tangentially, because I'll just like go on forever. But I do think it's important to examine really closely our discomfort around disability and around illness. And I am of the personal belief, please argue with me anytime, that a lot of that is linked to the like sort of shared human fear of mortality and acknowledging fragility. And as a species, we have really sort of asserted ourselves as perhaps much stronger and more able as a species than we are, and that's like a totally different existential philosophical thing that we don't have to go into. But I think the idea of a body that is weaker and broken, and I was saying yesterday, my definition of ableism hinges on the upholding of a ideal human form and then the subsequent denigration of a form that can't adhere to that. That idealized human species, that perfectly healthy specimen that doesn't exist anywhere. Everyone strives to achieve that role, whether you realize it or not. And it's just like extremely aggravated for the disabled body that it is more tangible that they cannot adhere to that standard. But it's like we have, whether you see it, whether it's in religion, whether it's in marketing, whether it's in anything, that ideal human body that is perfect exists, and we can all pinpoint it in some way. And just that existing is holding up ableism with massively powerful pillars. So thinking about that dynamic is what makes me think so much about how do we define empowerment then? Because we hear that word a lot, especially in the past decade. Again, it's risen so much, thinking about empowering, because we need to be talking about the bodies that are feeling disempowered, right? Empowerment comes from disempowerment, all of that. What is an empowered disabled body? And I feel like if you turn to the mass media, what that would tell you that an empowered disabled body is a body that is able to find a way to no longer be disabled. Empowerment linked to able-bodiedness. I'm only gonna give this one example because I talk about it with everyone that I can, but The Shape of Water. This film, if you've seen it, it's directed by Guillermo del Toro. It won an Oscar, maybe more than one Oscar. But the protagonist is mute. She does not speak. She's not deaf, but she is mute. And the film is about her relationship with a fish. That's not what I'm talking about. But there is a pivotal moment in her character development, which is her longing to be able to speak, if only to articulate this love that she has for a fish. But it is this moment that happens in the film. It's like a musical moment. None of that matters. But she gains the ability to speak, to sing, and she finally is able to articulate her feelings. Finally, she can show this fish that she loves him because she can speak. And it's like this huge cinematic moment. It's like, oh my God, she can talk, she can say I love you, she can sing it, she can dance, whatever. And I watched that, and for me it was like a whole bodily reaction of just like confusion, anger, frustration, like so like that moment is a moment of empowerment. If you analyze it, it is a moment of empowerment for that character. That character feels empowered. And I give this example because I talk about it a lot, and I think it's really frustrating. But that trope exists across all forms of media that we consume, and not just in media, but also in like someone said it in the chat, like when you're like watching something like tragic, inspiration porn upholds this sort of ableist idea of why we feel so compelled to take pity on the sick and take pity on the disabled as a means of like finding ways to empower them and all of this. So again, okay, we talked about shape of water, we're done with that. Let's come back to what we were talking about here, which is the empowered disabled body. And so I am of course, again, I'm always gonna be biased, but I'm the one talking, so that's fine. I think that redefining empowerment or throwing out the definitions that we have of empowerment altogether are vital, because I have experienced this personally, where I have been told that what I'm defining as my own personal empowerment is actually not empowering, which is really confusing. But the fact that a disabled body would dare to say, I'm okay being disabled, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it may not make the people virtually or in person uncomfortable to hear that, but it goes against all of the systems that are set up right now which essentially say to the disabled and ill person, don't worry, we're gonna do everything we can to make sure that you don't have to live like this anymore. And that's like an extreme way of putting it, but you find that everywhere. And so, I'm gonna start talking about my own practice because I have probably the most experience with that, I'd say. But something that's really important to me is confronting this fear. And it's a fear of being disempowered. And there's a difference, I think, when you're speaking about empowerment, and I think it's really important to me personally, and I hope to others as well, to understand that there's a lot of power in admitting powerlessness, and there's a lot of power in admitting helplessness, weakness, all of these things. I think like a big turning point in my own practice was feeling like I could document myself in positions of powerlessness and use that to create work that made me feel stronger than anything else had ever made me feel before. And I think a lot of that came in sort of letting myself be seen. And I think that, again, with all the work that I showed, it's so much so about just demanding some space to be seen and just like carving that out for yourself, whether that's documenting you at your weakest and all of that and then making that into video work or just disseminating that. I think so much that I am so drawn to and personally empowered by it in work that I see, and then also that I try to do in my own practice, is capturing vulnerability and showing that, to break away from the taboos around illness, which demand that you suffer in privacy and that no one sees that happen. And again, speaking about universal experiences, the demand for people to suffer privately is something that everyone can to relate to in some way or another. So thinking about all of that within my work and within the work that I seek out. Finding materiality within the body as well. So thinking about objectification, just again, talking about my own practice now, it's very, very liberating for me to sort of take objectification and say, yes, actually, I'm gonna treat my own body as an object. I'm gonna treat my body as this highly material thing that is being manipulated, that is being treated just as much as material as ink or pens or paper or clay, or sort of, if you think about more bodily sort of mediums, plaster, cement, all of these things, treating my body like that. So finding empowerment within embodied illness is sort of a defining characteristic, I think, of work that's confronting this, where it's embodying your brokenness, illness, disability in the way that feels the most powerful to you, and equipping that within your artwork, and then saying, look at it, see it, understand it, see this body in the way that I am controlling its imaging. So this is just some piece from my work, sort of talking, relating to what I've been talking about. This is a piece called Natural Disaster. That was a performance I did when my wheelchair was first delivered to my apartment that I captured or had captured on 8mm, and then it is displayed on the same wheelchair when it's installed. And then this is a frame from my piece Not Better Yet, and I think it certainly is an interesting time right now to be talking about sort of radical illness and sickness, because, I have been thinking about and living this sort of dialogue with disease and illness for a very long time, for my whole life, in fact. But now all of a sudden, the able-bodied mass public is hyper aware and hyper alert about illness, sickness, disease, all of these things. So I think it's a vital time to be talking about it right now. I think more than ever the disabled perspective is necessary in a time where finally there is a space, like a small sliver of space, to be highly critical of our own personal and emotional politics around health. But I just wanted to say that, I think seeing this giant word disease here, you gotta acknowledge coronavirus. But this is another piece that I had, and this one is called 5 Alarm or Pull for Help, and this is made using the placards from hospitals, where if you've ever visited someone in the hospital or gone to a hospital, these little strings that you pull in an emergency if you need help. It says pull for help usually on it, and they're in bathrooms and they're next to your bed and all of these places. And so this is a piece where I'm sort of playing with accessibility, because I out of the frustration I've experienced in moving through the world and moving through the gallery space and the museum space, like, I think accessibility is a tool and it's a material, so it needs to be treated as such and acknowledged as such, because there needs to be an intentionality. If you're making if a space is inaccessible, you're making that space inaccessible. So you need to talk about the intentionality behind that, the intentionality in essentially saying to a whole group of people, you're not going to be able to experience this in the same way. So I wanted to equip that in my work, because I was like, this is so powerful. This is so, this is like rife with, critical value and discourse and everything. So putting things out of reach, using stairs intentionally, all of these things. So this is like, chords that are about 10 feet in the air, 12 feet in the air. Some of them are like quite high up. So, inaccessibility is playing with that. And then this is work that I have sort of in progress right now, thinking about unlearning the body. So I'll come back to crip theory. My own personal sort of interest within crip theory is I'm drawing a lot from xenofeminism. I mentioned this yesterday, but xenofeminism and sort of cyborg feminism, thinking about the future of the anatomical as something that is no longer necessarily physiological. It is defining the body in really abstract terms. A lot of it has to do with emancipating the consciousness from the body. Of course, people have been thinking about the relationship between consciousness and body forever, since humans became conscious, but thinking about why are we restricting our definitions of body now to the highly physiological, when we live in an age where we can construct a body that functions better than any human body could, out of metal. And a lot of this is also coming, personally, from a place of using mobility aids, using crutches, wheelchairs, and then also having metal within me, stone, hip transplant, joint transplants, port in my chest, all of these things. So thinking about the body as cyborg, but also thinking about literally the body as a cyborg made out of metal, but also thinking about the relationship between ability and humanness, and now how it's like you can become very exasperated with ableism, because it's like the human body right now isn't even the most well-functioning thing that we have anymore, because we've made such advancements as a species. It's kind of embarrassing, because it's like we're holding, the flesh up as the paradigm of health and existence, when we're also building machines that are going to function better than us and last longer than us. So finding empowerment in that. I know some people, it can be very scary, but for me, it's very empowering, and I think a lot of that comes from cyborg feminism. That's what I'm thinking about here. So coming back to discomfort, and again, embodied illness, thinking about it again and again, but it's not it's not a one-sided thing. It's not just the able-bodied saying, oh, I feel uncomfortable because I'm seeing this sort of taboo, experiencing this taboo. I don't know how to interact with this body. I don't know how to relate to this body, all of these things. But it's also, oh my gosh, acknowledging and identifying the relationship between the discomfort that the disabled-bodied feels and the discomfort that the able-bodied feels, because no one is living in a vacuum. It's not like you can compartmentalize your own existence ever. And I think there is so much just feedback happening between both levels of discomfort, and we don't have the language to talk about it. So that's what I keep coming back to, is it's acknowledging your own internalized ableism as a disabled body, and it's the able-bodied person acknowledging their own able-bodied privilege. Those things together, it's like you need every piece to be able to create real progressive discourse. I have a line here on my PowerPoint that says, why do we not want to gaze upon the dying? And I think that phrase comes back to everything that I've sort of talked about here, where it's both the human fear of acknowledging a weakness within yourself that you see maybe magnified within the disabled experience, and it's the sort of tendency of the cultural space to focus on the hyper-positive and to really filter and censor the human experience into one that is highly consumable and easy to consume and easy to digest. So why don't we want to see these things, I think, is a question that I'm never gonna stop asking myself and also asking those around me, because the most sort of harrowing realizations are the ones that lead to the most progress. And it all, again, comes back to creating rightful space for the disabled body. So I, want to ask here and then in the chat for people to tell me, like, what does the word sickness even mean to you? Like, immediately, of course, I've just been feeding you my own personal thoughts and skewing your bias extremely. But what does sickness mean? What does that mean? If you had to just give me one word or 10 words to define it, and I genuinely mean put it in the chat and, speak up now. I'm just gonna give a second for everyone to think. But think of this as homework, you gotta do it. So if you're in the chat, I really wanna know. I want just like one word, put it in there, please, go ahead. Let's see here.
Abnormal.
Yeah, someone said abnormal. Bankruptcy. I like that. Yeah. Fear. No, take your time. I'm just, we're gonna sit with it for a second. Gotta sit with it for a second. Inconvenience. Functional challenge. Someone in the chat said pain. My dad actually said that. Adds a little layer of, complexity there. More people, I'm really putting the people in the chat on the spot, just because I can't see your guys' faces, you can turn off your cameras. Doesn't, I know there's, there's a good amount of you there. I can, loss of control, less than, deterioration. Yeah, all of these, again, it's limited, thank you. Yeah, so, keep sending them. Being bound to the moment, I really like that one. Yeah, being bound to the moment. I think when I speak about metaphor, illness and metaphor, would I in casual conversation say that we're living in sick times right now? Yes, absolutely, I would use that word. Time consuming, thank you, someone said time consuming, I like that. But it's how easily your brain makes those connections, because it's what you've been taught, the language that you've been taught since the day you were born, the language that you've heard. I think the reason I mean, right now, like, we are living in sick times. Like, it's not like I'm gonna say we have to stop. It's like, these are the metaphors in the language that we are using. It's not like I can say, stop saying that, right now the political system we're existing within is rifled with sickness, because it absolutely is. You cannot ignore the context and the heaviness of a word now. And so the illness as metaphor is a really super complicated thing, but it exists inherently. Someone said ignored as well. And so it's interesting, someone said bankruptcy, which I really like, because on one hand, you think sickness. I've been, talking in your guys' ears around illness and disability, so you're operating with an extreme bias. I acknowledge that. I know what I'm doing. But I say sickness, and on one hand, it's, you see the body, you think of the hospital, you think of disease, all these things. And on the other hand, you think of the corrupt, you think of the disgusting, you think of all of this bleakness, whatever political connotations you think that it may have. And neither one of those anymore is more valid than the other, because of the way we engage with language. The way that humans engage with language is something that there is no point in saying, in thinking about it this in that way. Someone says in the chat, this isn't one word, but I've been thinking about how illness and the understanding of it mutates from one language to another. Yeah, right. And again, thinking about translation, something I spoke about yesterday. But with metaphor, it's a very interesting thing, the way things translate from one language to another. So it's a really heavy thing. And the reason I ask for people to sort of just tell me, obviously it's not right off the cuff, because you're at an event that's around ableism, so it's like, it's not springing a old surprise on you thinking about illness, but it's being able to identify those things and see it everywhere. It's kind of like a waterfall effect. Like, you realize that there's so much within one word that it almost is extremely overwhelming. But to sort of go back to some of the words that were put out in the chat, just saying, not to call out my father, but he said pain, and I think that's interesting because it's, of course, framed around my own existence. My illness and disability is heavily defined by being in an extreme amount of pain, an unbearable amount of pain. And I think that thinking about sickness and pain, again, discomfort, coming back to that, is so immensely uncomfortable to see something or someone in pain, whether it's an animal or human. Humans are animals, but witnessing that is so exhausting and difficult for anyone, myself included. And I think it's very interesting to think about the human as from an evolutionary point. Not that we need to go into that, but like, why are we distressed by a member of our own species in pain? You can look at it in a highly scientific manner and think that it is because it makes you scared for your own survival. It reminds you of your own immense fragility to see something that is identical to you in terms of species suffering so much, because you see that potential in yourself. And I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. In fact, I'm advocating for so much more of that. But at the same time, I advocate it, but I understand that why would someone put themselves in that immensely uncomfortable position when they absolutely do not have to? And that is what able-bodied privilege is. It's saying, I'm never going to experience that, so I don't have to think about it, I don't have to look at it, I don't ever have to acknowledge it. And the reality of the situation we're in right now is that there's nothing stopping that from being true. At the moment, you can move through the world as an able-bodied person, and it will cater to your comfort, and it will make sure that you never truly have to confront these things unless you make a distinct effort to, or unless you are put in a position where you don't have a choice, i.e. confronting illness yourself or in someone that you know, someone that you love. Again, coming back to the vital nature of anecdotal sharing in raising awareness around able-bodied privilege. Someone said unknown for sickness. I think that is also really cool. I think that a lot of the taboo around disability and around illness does come from not knowing. And we are experiencing that right now in a super extreme and universal way, where we're experiencing a global health pandemic that is, we don't have any answers right now. And I think that that's an interesting contextualization of everything that's going on here, but also, you know, the fact that there's so much about the human body and its failure and its malfunction that we do not have access to understanding. And the human species, I think, is defined by its desperate need to feel like it understands everything about itself and about everything in the world around it, and, you know, the universe around it, and that sort of desperate need being contrasted by the reality of the great unknown, and the sort of reality of the unknown that is essential to the human experience. But I think sickness fits very well into that. And then this person says, unknown meaning not knowing what your body will reveal about itself in sickness. And I really love that. I will speak from a very personal place with that. It's again that sort of precarious fragility that is hard to admit, that you are in a state where you are not in control of your body, and your body is actually in control of you, if you think about that interesting dynamic, but not knowing what is going to happen to you. And I think, you know, I'd like to argue that none of us know what's going to happen to us. And, you know, not to bring down the room, but the only thing we know is what's going to happen is we're going to die. But like, I think that, yes, unknown meaning not knowing what the body will reveal about itself. You know, when we like to feel that we have a great amount of control over the vulnerability, and whether that's emotional or physical, that we extend to those around us. Illness certainly strips that away. Sickness certainly strips that away, in the sense that you are no longer in control of your vulnerability to a certain extent. And yes, there's a great deal of exposure in sickness that makes both the able-bodied person and the disabled person uncomfortable. You know, it all comes back to this sort of discomfort. Just one last one from, or, you know, just like, you know, deterioration, yes. Limited, yes, in terms of, you know, also we're going to talk just limited for a second. Limits, the limits that are placed on the body. There's an interesting dynamic, you know, in terms of emancipation and the body as something that is, you know, striving for full emancipation, for full freedom in all of these things, and limitation and a lack of freedom being connoted with sickness, with disability, and all of these things, in many ways is true. But I think the symbolism that carries, it was one that you can't ignore. And I think that, you know, how do we don't have necessarily a language to talk about how limitation can be okay, and if not okay, certainly a reality that just needs to be confronted. Pity is a super complex thing that I don't really want to go into today, because it's just, you know, it's quite a lot, and it's you know, yeah, we don't have the time. But I think what is the relationship between the able body and pity? What is the relationship between the disabled body and pity? And I guess instead of going into it, I'll just ask everyone who's here today to just think about what your relationship to empathy and pity is when you consider disability. What is your direct emotional response to a disabled body, to a sick body? And there, again, I want to really emphasize that acknowledging all of these things, we need to separate ourselves from the inherent wrongness, and that's an incredibly difficult thing to do. But you know, and it's not my job or anyone else's job to teach someone how to separate themselves from the shame of able-bodiedness. But certainly, it is a vitally necessary thing, because you need to be able to talk about it in order to confront it. And we are living in a system that encourages us to take pity on the sick and the disabled, because it is what fuels that oppression and that marginalization, that degrading, all of that. There's a difference between pity and empathy, of course. You know, I don't need to, maybe I do, but I'm not going to sort of explain that, but right now. But you know, I'll talk about it with you one-on-one if anyone's interested in that. But yes, so invisible, again, ignore time, all these things, being bound to the moment. I'm just going to come back to that one really quickly. I think that's very heavy, and you know, whether you're talking about being bound to this moment right now, today, sitting in front of a room full of people wearing masks, we're all 6 feet or more apart from each other, or talking about sort of the way sickness and illness forces one to confront, you know, the moment of illness and the finality of life and all of these things. So let's see, we have a question. Oh yeah, this is great. Curious, the language of fighting and battling illness. I'm so glad. Thank you, Jillian, for saying that in the chat. We're talking about, you know, kind of goes back to like inspiration porn or whatever, but fighting and battling illness, like why am I, okay, let me just, sorry, I got really excited about saying that in the chat. That is, of course, a term that we're all familiar with. We've all either used or heard or whatever, but if I'll share with you my own perspective. I feel every day like I'm fighting and battling with my illness in a very literal way, in the terms that my body is precluding me from doing the things that I want to do, and I feel like I'm being antagonized by my body. And so it's a really interesting relationship, because this is sort of the necessity for the disabled privilege. Oh, here we go. But I should be able to articulate that, and be able to articulate that without then the larger societal connotation being illness and disability is a fight, and it is a fight that should be fought, like in terms of if you are disabled and you are not actively fighting against your disability, then you are not doing something right, and you are in fact doing something quite wrong. Striving towards that able-bodied standard of health, which is that is the connotation that exists within fighting and battling, and it is, I mean, the semiotics of it is super loaded, right? But like the shame there, the obligation to fix, to separate, and to distance yourself from your own illness, all of these things. And it's not, I wish it was as simple as saying, I can be sick and that's fine. But it's not, because no experience is a vacuum. You know, I see my loved ones struggling with my illness a great deal. Anyone who is experiencing that can relate. Anyone who has had someone in their life can relate to that. It's not simple. You know, the language is simple. It's really easy to identify that and say that is wrong. That is, that is shaming an entire body of people. That is denigrating and oppressing an entire body of people. But when you get down into the reality of the lived and embodied experience, in many ways, illness is a fight, and there is a lot of fighting that happens in that experience, but certainly not in the way that the language that we are comfortable with connotes. And so that's what, we're operating within a really primitive language. Again, this is what I'm talking about when I'm saying we don't have the language that we need to discuss this, because it's like, I'm fumbling over my words, trying to just delineate between me fighting and struggling every day with my illness, which is a really valid thing, and society telling me that my illness is something that needs to be fought. Because then I'm like, well, no, it's not. But yes, it is, but no, it's not. So, stop telling me that it is. So it's like I shouldn't have to be having that insane monologue internally and externally, but that's the reality of the situation, because we don't have the right words to be talking about sickness. So thank you for that. I hope I was able to sort of articulate that properly. It is an extremely frustrating thing, which is, what we're here to talk about. But yeah, so let me get back to my slide, because, I'm really excited doing this little exercise. But again, it's not we're talking about the museum after all of this, it's not as simple as curating more disabled artists, but this is what I was really hammering home yesterday. It's about really shifting the critical dynamic of the space to accommodate this disabled perspective. And this is what I keep coming back to. It's like there is never going to be a way to develop nuance without bringing in and supporting and uplifting and amplifying the disabled experience, because no one can advocate for the disabled experience other than disabled and sick people. No one should be advocating, people should be advocating for it, but no one should be articulating it as loudly and as clearly as the actual people experiencing this, because, like I've said, that is the point in time that we are at. We still are developing a frame of reference, and we need to be able to acknowledge how early on in that process we are, and not sort of be deluded about that, because we'd all very much so like to believe, I'm a part of that we are much more progressive than we actually are. We we examine the place that we are in society, and there is an immense amount of celebration to be had for progress that has been made, but we need to humble ourselves, certainly, and you know, you look at the way that disabled bodies are treated, and you really realize how much of a deficit there is in our social language around you know, the oppressed and the erased. So the body is protest again. If it's bold, it's important, as you can see in my slide techniques. But you know, all of this comes back to the why, you know, like we have been bouncing around this topic, and really at the crux of it is that to be sick, to be ill, to be disabled, and to be vocalizing that and being sort of unabashed in that, regardless of every heavy aspect of shame and guilt and all that you're experiencing, all that is a part of it, but to be embodying that is a radical act right now, because it is so unseen, undocumented, unheard. And not only is it unseen and undocumented, but like I've said, there are systems actively in place that are working to erase the voices of people who are trying to speak up about it and are trying to, you know, exist in their disabled body at peace. And you know, the whether it's the medical system, the media around us, everything are really actively saying that you should not be comfortable with your illness, you should not be comfortable with your disability. So it is an act of protest right now, which is empowering in many ways, but also very frightening, and in a lot of ways, to say, why is it so radical for me to dare to be comfortable dealing with my disability and like asking for the space to deal with my illness, how I want to do it, and defining that for myself. Why is this such a difficult thing to do? And it truly is. And I mean, again, I want to bring back emphasis that it's not an insular experience, as much as I personally would like to believe that it is, because it would be a lot easier. It's you know, it's an emotional thing, but I think that really giving due to how much erasure and violence is happening to the disabled body makes you understand that it is a radical act to say I'm sick and I'm okay with being sick. Let's see, just from the chat, if you're not fighting hard enough, then you're giving up. This makes able-bodied, those who are not suffering from mental illness, feel at risk. And that is a really powerful thing. The idea of being seen as someone who is giving up or who is not doing the right thing. I think there's a lot that I could say about this. I'm kind of like, I mean, again, it's impossible for me to speak without feeling it extremely personally and emotionally. I mean, two days ago, I spent a 10-hour day at the hospital, seeing my doctors for the first time in months, and I think it's an extremely violent set of ideas that we have around the way the disabled body functions, where everyone truly believes that they have a place to frame someone else's disabled experience and what they should be doing with their body. It seems like a really fundamental thing that every body should be able to dictate its own existence and be emancipated in that, but you realize that there are so many caveats to that, and it really is such a sort of exclusive thing when you catch yourself having an opinion on what a disabled person should be doing or what a sick person should be doing in their own decisions around their body. Everyone does this, and you can justify it however you'd like, and I think in a lot of ways it is valid, if, you know, in terms of loving someone, caring for someone, all of these things. But thank you. Yeah, like what does it mean to be giving up? I think that's such an interesting, again, the semiotics of it, it's so loaded, because what are you giving up on? You're giving up on the ableist standard of health that has been fed to you your whole life. If you're giving up on that, then all power to you. But no, you're being seen as giving up on your own body, and you realize in that very, very dangerous language that the control of your body has been placed into everyone's hands but your own. And you think about why we see the disabled body as so helpless, as so in need of all the help it can get. And it's a hard thing to talk about, because you don't you're not criticizing the individual empathy of people in your life, but you are criticizing the societal structures which make able-bodied people believe that they have not only the right but the obligation to intervene on the part of the sick and disabled person. And that leads to censorship. And it all comes back to the museum. It can all come back to the museum, but I am speaking much more largely now, thinking about what rights are stripped away from the disabled person. And I can keep looping it back to everything that I've said about the art space, about how what is reflected at society in large heavily impacts the way that exhibits are curated. But I think we're like much larger than that now. Again, from the chat, the idea of overcoming obstacles or disabilities or whatever is a national, if not global, obsession. From the hero's journey to politics, everything is framed in terms of becoming better. That's the real sickness. And I love this because I actually kind of obsess a lot over the term better and worse. I cannot stop thinking about it. The frames that I showed earlier, the piece is called Not Better Yet. And just to share like a quick personal anecdote about that piece that I'm sure, some people who know me know this, but I was really struggling. I had this amazing sort of footage of myself contorting my body and performing in this hospital setting. And I really had no idea how to take that footage and translate it into articulate exactly what I was feeling. I was really struggling with it. And I ended up being hospitalized here in Los Angeles, which is a regular occurrence, but it was a particularly sort of gnarly hospitalization where, on top of my own struggles with my body, the infrastructure of the hospital was being pretty violent and oppressive and a lot to deal with. So my father very kindly came down and helped me sort of transition from being in the hospital to back being at my apartment with someone, a caregiver, to make that experience easier. And I had this really tough sort of discussion with him where I sort of came to a place where I was like, I need you to leave so I can get back to my routine and my life, because when you're here, I fall into this pattern of being taken care of that feels extremely safe and extremely comforting, but I need to be able to push myself to go out even though I'm in pain, just so I can live the life that I'm trying to live, which is that we don't have to talk about my own personal relationship to my body and all of that. But essentially what came out of that is my dad was like, I'll stay until you're better. And I had to say, if you stay until I'm better, you're never gonna leave, because I'm never going to get to that place. And that's that idea of it's like a wall, it's like a realization, it's like a grief that I have, and that a lot of people can relate to in terms of illness and disability, where it's you're constantly reckoning your own sickness because the world around you is telling you that there is an end point that you're just not reaching yet, and you're not trying hard enough to reach, and if you just tried a little harder, you get there. And then every whatever timeline it falls for you, you have this realization where you're like, oh my fucking God, I'm never gonna get there, and this is a trick, it's a trap, it's a carrot on a stick, and it's a process that never ends. But so that's my personal relationship to that word, better and worse, but not better yet, not better ever. It's never going to be better. And that's a hard thing for people to hear. It's a hard thing as humans to hear, because we are fed the good, we are told to strive for the good. That word is super loaded. I think my problems with better and worse, are you feeling better? Are you feeling worse? It's connected inherently to goodness and wrongness. And humans are terrifyingly moral creatures. It's a little as we all understand, to an oppressive level, the ways as a species we relate to morality is dangerous. But to connote physical disability and illness and a physical state of health to wrongness, to badness, to a sort of linear trajectory where on one end you're healthy and on one end you're sick, and your whole life should be spent moving in one direction, is terrifying. And it's concentrated in its toxicity for this sick and disabled body that is living this experience in a hyper concentrated way. But for able-bodied people as well, that's what I'm trying to say here, is ableism affects everyone, because no one is healthy for their whole life, and that's also something that is quite overwhelming, I think, for people to wrap their head around when we're talking about ableism. I'm not just talking about people in wheelchairs. That's just the easiest thing to talk about because it's so coded in its visual language. But there is no such thing as a person who stays healthy their whole life, and that's a really sort of, it can be very emancipating, but it's also, you know, very complex. So thank you for that. Saying that this is sort of global obsession. I don't even want to you know, we can have a whole different conversation around capitalism and the idea of getting better, but like you think about professional language, career language, educational language, again, all things rooted to the institution as sort of like a omniscient presence, but that striving for the best, striving to be better, striving for more. I mean, you can link it to capitalism in a very direct and satisfyingly easy way. But yeah, I mean, we connote it to worth. It's linked to self-worth. Why is the word worse making me feel bad about myself? Why is my doctor telling me that I'm doing worse? Like, why is it such a heavy guilt that goes beyond fear and physical trepidation? It's, you start talking about it like I have here in front of all of you, and you realize that it's this insane Pandora's box that links to semiotics, and links to the hyper-personal. It links to all of a sudden an experience that you've had that you are now framing through a language of ableism or of disability that recontextualizes it. You are realizing the way that you've treated someone or the way that someone has treated you. You are unpacking that pain. You're unpacking that shame. So it's like, it's a domino effect. And I think that I'm so thankful for this platform to have had this discussion, because people aren't even putting this out into the world to be heard right now. The struggles around illness and ableism, like I said, are super internal and insular right now, where people are sitting with it quietly. People are feeling like they need to sit with it quietly, and you don't have people speaking out about it actively and even just talking about it. Like, I think we can all sort of understand there is no progress without discussion, and you should never be afraid of just vocalizing things, because it's that internalization, that like trapping everything inside, that perpetuates the notion that all of these things need to be private, quiet, tampered, hidden. Going back to one of my first slides, the disabled body needs to be hidden. That's all of that, and everyone is compliant in it. Of course, it needs to start with the able-bodied individual, because they are the ones who are operating in a position of power, and that they are being catered to by the world. But I mean, I think like I'm never gonna stop doing work around my own shame, because it's never gonna go away. And it's about finding a way to put that into some form of articulation. It doesn't have to be verbal, of course not, but I think just finding those languages is super important. This is just a page from my sketchbook that I wanted to share. This is like a sort of something that I have this, like this sort of writing process where I try to sort of just jot down a thought a day at least, and I go back through the pages and I see I've been trying to say this thing for a long time. In many different ways, I keep iterating the same thing, and I write down these questions, or I draw like a diagram or something where it's like sick, dying, sick, dying, like in like a loop. Like I draw these like ways to sort of articulate my thoughts, but I look at this page and it's heavy for me, because from a personal standpoint, there's people in my life who care about me, who struggle in very valid and immense ways with my own illness, in perhaps ways that I am desensitized to, in terms of the difficulty of seeing someone you love suffering and needing help, just because it is perhaps rooted to structures of ableism does not invalidate what it means to care and love for a disabled and sick person. Absolutely not. It's that nuance that is not being articulated as well. But this is just like a snapshot, just a page from from my sketchbook that documents the ongoing struggle that I have personally in being okay with being sick, even though I'm such a huge advocate for it. But like every day I have to wake up to this and sort of have that dialogue where it's like, am I doing something wrong by not feeling as ashamed as I do in my disability? And the answer is no, but I can say that now on camera and being recorded and everything. But again, it's that hyper personal experience with disability that is so vital to this discourse that is important to document. So, you know, I share a lot of this in my own practice, but also I'll share it with you now. It's not a simple thing. Even as the person, you know, getting up on this soapbox to talk to you all, I'm telling you, I struggle with this every day, and there's a lot of internalized stuff that I deal with all the time. So it's not like I you know, obviously I hope it's clear, I don't believe I have any answers or that, or any, you know, serious answers or any sort of position to speak on this as someone who's no longer struggling with it, because no one reaches that place. I'd love to meet the person that has reached that place. I think that that'd be amazing, but again, it's about acknowledging struggle that lasts forever. That's, you know, for me to say that one day I'll reach a place where I'm okay with my illness 100% would be counterintuitive to the point that I'm trying to make, which is that we need to be able to have language around a struggle that lasts forever. And that is a universal thing, not just with illness, but I am contextualizing within illness because that's what I want to do, and I think it's important. So I thought I'd share that page. I touched on this super briefly yesterday. What is the ideal accessible space? This was a question that was asked to me recently. And it was sort of asked in the context of like, if you had to like design a space that was accessible, perfectly accessible, like tell us, like what would it be? Money, I think they specifically, money is not an issue. And I was like, well, you're right, that's not the issue. It's not about if I had the money to create the perfect accessible space. Because again, accessibility goes beyond, oh, can we get the funding to have translators? Can we get the funding to have audio guides for every piece, for every person, if we, you know, at capacity, all those things? That's a superficial problem. So I included this because, sorry to trick you, but I can't answer this question for you. If that's what you're homing for, it's not going to happen. So I put this in because I don't have an answer to this question, and I think that's the reason I've included it, is because it was such an overwhelming moment for me being asked that, sort of one, for many reasons, which I'll explain now. One, sort of being the fact that I am a disabled and ill person that is like talking about it constantly. I am also not the spokesperson for disability everywhere and illness everywhere and accessibility everywhere. That's a huge burden to put on me to be able to answer this question. Dear God, it's so overwhelming. But also in the sense that there is still this perspective on progress, which is like, just draw me a blueprint and we'll do it together somehow. And it's like, if it were that easy, there are literally millions of people around the world who would be able to give you an amazing blueprint for an ideal accessible space, whether I'm talking about architecturally, structurally, infrastructure. Like, there are architects, there are, you know, people who are more qualified in terms of physical fabrication of an accessible space than I am. There's all of these things. So it's like the boiling down of a radical moment of progress to just like one person saying, here's the plan, guys, like, let's do it, here it is. It's like, that's not what progress is. And so this is important for the discussion we're having now, but also I hope, you know, that the connections are being made to all other forms of oppressive practices and everything. But again, re-articulating something I said yesterday in reference to this question, I did try to answer it. I, of course, you know, I wasn't like, get that, I'm not going to answer that ridiculous question. No, like I have, you know, I can list a plethora of ways in which to make an ideal accessible space. Again, it is a fantasy because, you know, but it was overwhelming to me for all the reasons I've listed, but also because I caught myself in a moment speaking so passionately about how to make a space accessible for the disabled and ill-bodied, and then I was all of a sudden like, say for a moment, join me on this fantasy where we all enter together in a perfectly accessible space. Whatever that means to you, whatever completely inachievable fantasy that is, we enter a perfectly physically accessible space for the disabled body. There are so many other bodies that would still be othered within that space, and it is a grounding reality that there is no compartmentalization, really. You know, of course, I'm here to speak about ableism in the art space, but you cannot separate the fact that prejudices are so linked and they are so interconnected. If I was to walk, I said this yesterday, but if I was to walk into this fantasy accessible space, this museum that is, you know, souped up beyond imagine to accommodate the disabled body, I would still be in an institution that is othering to the body of color, and to the body that is queer, and to the body that is not adhering to the gender binary. All of these things, it is a harrowing reality that, you know, if we just made, for instance, the Smithsonian perfectly accessible, that would then solve the issues that the Smithsonian has. No, it's not that easy. So I wanted to include that just as like a personal moment that I had, that progress isn't simple. Like, I think, you know, I'm here to give a talk on accessibility, so I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot by saying, well, there's, you know, it's a part of a bigger problem. You know, it's obviously I'm here to talk about this because it's so vitally important, and I really hope that I've made that point clear. But if we're building a frame of thought around ableism, it is also so important not to become hyper-focused on that, and to acknowledge that your able-bodied privilege is not also walking hand with your class privilege, with your white privilege, if that so applies to you. If with your geographic privilege, we are in the United States, that is an immense position of privilege, regardless of how sick of a society we're living in right now. It is all of these things together. So I wanted to put that little bleak slide in there for you guys, you know, keep it grounded, keep it humble. But you know, just kind of coming to a close here, again, I've said this so many times already, but the museum is an institution, and creating space, demanding space, that's what it sort of the crux of everything I'm talking about here in terms of embodied illness and embodied illness in an art practice. It comes back to the demanding space that is not being given to you right now. And I think there are really important cracks in the foundation right now, which are important to like drive a wedge into. You know, I've had people ask me like, what is it, you know, what is the like plan for ill and disabled people to like be in the art space more? And I'm like, well, it's kind of like elbowing your way through a crowd. Like, you kind of have to like get in there and make the space that is like there but is not necessarily readily being offered to you. Thankfully, I think there are artists who are working in this nonstop and who are being seen, who are being represented. We should not diminish the importance of that. And of course, I am coming to you live and in Technicolor from a art space, from, you know, a gallery, a museum, like a center for contemporary art. And so this is important, like this discourse here, the space being created, people being willing to listen, people being willing to join in on Zoom, all of this is very important. And so, again, I mentioned this a little bit before, but we are in the pandemic, a global pandemic, and so I think that this is a super critical moment. I kind of have joked that like we had the most democratizing moment in gallery and museum access happen completely by accident or completely like against the will of the museum and art space, because suddenly everyone was trapped at home and people were flailing to access art in a way in which you know, there was a sudden rush of accessibility. And It's important to note that, of course, this accessibility happened in direct response to able-bodied need and able-bodied inconvenience. So I'm not turning my nose up at the immense amounts of accessibility features that have been put into place, but again, do not conflate accessibility with disability representation, because we are experiencing accessibility in response to, like I said, the able-bodied person saying, oh no, I can't go to the museum now, what am I to do? Because disabled people have been asking for that for a very long time and sort of getting like the cold shoulder. So it's an important moment now. And when I talk about sort of like the cracks in the foundation or like elbowing your way, like right now we're all sort of like flailing and we're all on sort of the same learning curve. So right now, luckily, I guess you could say, we're in this moment where we're all collectively a part of redefining or continuing to define ableism in the art space and accessibility within the art space. And I think we have all the tools in front of us because of this very specific pandemic that we're in to make the sort of like immense amount of change that hopefully can be mirrored in the physical space when things go back to normal. I'm sorry, I hate using that term, but when we're not operating under the same restrictions that we are now, if and when that happens. But yeah, so, you know, acknowledging that we're in this sort of really special time right now. And I, again, like it's you know, I'm sitting here behind a desk, like I said, looking out onto a face of masks and looking to a screen of you know, people tuning in digitally. And it's a very sort of interesting and incredible moment. But yeah, so just, you know, acknowledging also that the digital is not fully accessible. The reason we're not on Zoom today is because Zoom does not have an integrated closed captioning system, and that was something that was really important for me to have for people watching, to be able to turn on closed captions and have that. And so you realize that the digital is still, there still is accessibility to be happening in spaces that are not physical, and that's a really important thing. Of course, accessibility also speaks to intellectual accessibility, emotional accessibility. I think I touched on, I'm not gonna repeat this, but I did touch on this yesterday, understanding the scope of ableism. I think I've like blown up the scope of accessibility today more than I anticipated even doing. I talked about this yesterday. The city of Los Angeles was sued because of creating, you know, low-income housing that was actually really inaccessible to people who were using mobility aids and using wheelchairs. And it was they had to take it to court, which is good and bad. You know, it's not no one left that situation feeling like it was a win, I'm sure. But also thinking about legislation, it's really important. I think all political discussion is really necessary, and an examination of the legislation that we have and don't have. But just to put into context, the US's refusal to sort of engage with the disabled perspective on a legislative level. Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, little cute little acronym, was made in 1977. President Ford reluctantly signed off on this act, and it promised billions of dollars of funding for equal opportunity education, and to educators on how to have disabled individuals in their classroom. And ideally, this program would abolish the sort of practice of special education, which is a terrifying subject that we do not need to go into right now, one of the failings of the education system. But it would sort of make it so that every classroom was equipped to handle all students, all needs. I don't know if you guessed, but this program has not been funded since it was implemented in 1977. In fact, the most funding it's received was 14% of the promised funds, which happened during the first iteration, the first 4 years of Obama's presidency. And since then, it has dropped incredibly low. I don't want to give a wrong statistic, but certainly below 10% of the promised funds. And please understand that the lack of funding of this goes directly against a law that has been put into place. Lawmakers are aware of this. Lawmakers are compliant in this. The underfunding of this is being justified every year, every month. It is terrifying, and it is happening in front of all of our eyes. But also, completely behind the scenes because no one knows that this is happening. No one is casting light onto this. Again, this is such a terrifying topic to broach, but need-based supplemental income, disability income. I encourage everyone to sort of educate themselves more on this because again, we're running out of time, but this will all be in the documents and the things materials that I'll be disseminating. But to qualify for disability in California, you need to have assets under $2,000. That is including savings in the bank and property, which is, I hope you understand what the connotations of that are. So it is trapping, it's a part of the cycle of poverty that ropes in the ill and disabled into not being able to get the help that they need, and also when they are contending with not being able to get the employment that they need. It's a super complicated thing. I wish that I had a whole another 2 hours to talk about just that. I don't, but again, I will be circulating all of this information for everyone who wants it. And then, someone said in the chat, poverty with an exclamation point. We need to talk about it. Yes, yeah, I think it's we are just as ill-equipped to speak about class and to speak about poverty as we are about illness in many ways that have parallels, and the overlap of that is a very important dark area, dark in terms of there's no light being cast onto it. We don't have the language, again, to talk about illness in poverty and illness in relation to class and all of that. So I'll finish it with this image. Illness is radical. Don't look away from it. This is another, I love making graphics, so enjoy that. But I'm gonna stop presenting now. If there are any questions, any more thoughts in the chat, please take the time now to say something. And otherwise, if anyone in the audience would like to contribute, the mic is there. I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you, everyone, for listening to me go on and on. Thank you. I appreciate the clapping. It's very nice. But yeah, if there's any questions here, I can see myself up there, open the chat. My dad says awesome. Thank you, Dad. I have a good familial, oh my gosh, my screen is freezing. Wow.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk today.
Of course.
When you actually mentioned it a bit towards the end of the talk about how because of COVID, all these spaces, whether it's the doctor's office to the art spaces moving online, you mentioned wanting to use Google Meet
Yes.
for closed caption. I see someone in the comment section talking about erasure accessibility on Zoom and how check this looks. And maybe the context of that, there's this promise that through algorithms and machine learning that search engines or options that used are better able or better to customize for us and better serve us.
Yeah.
But of course they're a reflection of the programmers. And there's a lot of conversations about how these platforms have embedded in them racism and blackness. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on how you see ableism playing out in these kinds of spaces.
Yeah, so within this person was talking about ableism within the search engine and within sort of like the digital tools that we have. And I love that you said that all of these sort of online platforms that we're engaging with are a representation of their programmers. And able-bodied and able-bodied provision, everything exists so prevalently within the career space, of course, but thinking about like what does accessibility look like in programming, like that is such a like experimental, like abstract thing to even wrap your head around, simply because it's like a completely unbroached subject. But thinking about search engines, thinking about the technology that we have, laptops, computers, phones are designed to be used by able-bodied people. I think only now people are sort of becoming aware of like screen reader for the blind and for the visually impaired, and these sort of ways in which accessibility is needing to be integrated into technology, but is like there's a lot of difficulty around that, because like I spoke about this yesterday, but accessibility is being treated as an afterthought, where it's like, let's build these things and then let's figure out how disabled people can use them. And I think my answer to this sort of question that was posed in terms of ableism within the digital space is that it functions very similarly to the way that it functions in the physical space, in which measures of accessibility are being treated as an afterthought and are not integrated, and in fact their integration is either really clunky, really defunct, or non-existent at all. The fact that simple subtitling and transcription features are something that you have to pay for, and are not automatically integrated, is one, beautiful illustration of capitalism within the technology space, but profiting off of the prevalent nature of inaccessibility, saying that we see that there is this deficit, we have the technology, we have these immense strides in artificial intelligence, let's commodify that, and let's make the disabled and ill person pay to have equitable access to a person who does not need these features. I think examining it within the tech space, like you pointed out, really crystallizes that in the ways that people are profiting off of inaccessibility, because you look for it and you realize that to make your browser, to make your computer, to make your interaction with the digital space accessible, you have to pay extra. So I think, a really valuable way of examining ableism within the digital space is to examine it through a capitalist lens as well. Someone asked in the chat that I use the word illness in the same way that I used the word disability, and that complex personal thing, but I'm saying that they are things that I think in the sort of critical discourse it's valuable to separate them, and I'm using them interchangeably because I'm speaking from my own personal experience as someone who is both sick and disabled, or both ill and disabled, but of course there are people who are sick and not disabled, and there are people who are disabled and not sick. I could make a bunch of fun Venn diagrams about that, which I actually will when I get home. Now that you've said that, that's like great. I'm really excited to do that. But for me, I'm using illness in the same way I'm using disability, because I am speaking from personal experience, but also because at one, it's a illustration of my own ableist language, conflating the two as well, or being used to conflating the two, or assuming that everyone else will understand the conflation of the two, and an illustration of the connotation of disability with being sick, again, catching myself in this, but also it being reflected in my own experience, so really complicated and interesting. But for those, thank you for asking, because there is and should be a separation between those two, and I can't speak to every disabled person's experience. I'm 100% sure that there are many, many sick or disabled people who would not necessarily agree with my outlooks on disability relating to death, relating to illness. In fact, there's a whole subsection within crip theory that begs for the separation of disability and mortality. It in fact says that the conflation of the two is very dangerous, and I agree that it is when able-bodied people are doing it, but I think that it's empowering when disabled people choose to do it, which is what I do. So I do want to make that clarification, and I think, thank you, it's an important thing that you brought up. Someone's at the mic in person, so please speak forward.
Fantastic to listen to you.
Thank you.
I just had a question. It's kind of on my personal experience. Have you had, as an art maker, any able-bodied people ever say that your work was inaccessible because of the nature of the subject and you using the blind?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, just to repeat, someone in the audience asked if I've ever had someone, an able-bodied person, tell me that my work is inaccessible to them because of its subject matter and because of the nature in which I'm making the work. And I absolutely have. I have, when I first started doing performance and video work, I was actually met with a great deal of repulsion and anger and discomfort around my work, and I was having people tell me that I was, how do I say this, that I was perhaps failing in my articulation of the point I was trying to make because it was too much for them to watch. It was like too overwhelming visually. And I understand that from the perspective of, you know, there's a lot of sort of medical imagery, surgical imagery that I was using in my earlier work, sort of like very violent imagery, uncomfortable imagery, and people were, you know, saying that that was a barrier of entry for them, and that also sort of, I was, you know, precluding them from accessing what I was trying to say. Oh wait, oh my gosh, whoa, what happened? Oh my gosh, whoa, let me join again. Hi, I think I just got kicked out of my own call, but I'm back now. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, great. Awesome. Anyways, Google Meet was not having what I was saying, but yeah, so the answer is yes. And I think that I really actually understood where they were coming from in the sense that my early work was fueled very much so by anger, I'd say, and I am now really able to see that. And I think a lot of the work when I was first sort of being like, I can use my body as a tool, I can like make work about this and talk about this, and like I can capture it on video and all these things, like it was revolutionary for me. And in doing that, I was a little like frustrated when people were not being receptive to it, and in fact were being like having an adverse reaction to it in a way that for a while fueled me even more, where I was like, oh, you're uncomfortable? Good, here's some more. Look at it. Like, you know what, you're just making me more excited. Like that's sort of the reaction that I was having. And that was a really necessary part of my practice, I'd say, because without that I wouldn't be where I am now. But there wasn't as much nuance within my work thinking about power and disempowerment, where for me, when I was making that work, that was much more difficult, I think, for people to see. Well, my work is still difficult, I think, but for different reasons. But where it was like accosting visually and sort of very overwhelming to see. I was feeling like my only source of empowerment would be in completely controlling the viewer's experience of my body, where I was saying, you have no choice but to like stand here and watch me do this thing, and if it makes you uncomfortable, then good, and that's it. That's the end of the discussion. And now, of course, I realize how lacking in nuance that was, and how if I'm going to be talking about accessibility and ableism, the viewer, especially the able-bodied viewer's perception of me, is something that I need to factor into my work, whether it's conceptually, critically, or actually in the fabrication of it. So now I'm trying to be much more conscious of that, and in the sort of more recent works that I've shown, I think like in my earlier work that was very overwhelming, I wasn't allowing myself to be vulnerable. And in fact, I was trying to say that there is no vulnerability, it's all power. And now, a lot of my work is really about how it's all vulnerability, all and almost no power, and of course finding power in that, whatever. And I think that while I'm not catering to the needs or feeling of my able-bodied viewer, certainly the work does feel more accessible, I think, because I'm leaving so much more room for that nuance. So yeah, and I think definitely still some people would say that my work is perhaps inaccessible to them, and I would say, okay, you know, all right, that's you know, there's no work that's going to be universally accessible to anyone. So thank you. Any more questions? Thank you. I think, you know, we're getting close to the end here. I just want to, I'll give some space if people want to percolate a little bit, but you know, I just want to thank everyone for being here while people are thinking if they have any more questions. Thank you everyone. It's been an amazing 2 days here at ICA, in the Zoom world with everyone. I just want to thank everyone so much. So if there's no more questions, any more questions in the chat box? Just to people saying thank you, which, you know, I really appreciate. Thank you, everyone. So I think, you know, I'll say that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you, guys. Yeah,
Thank
so
you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, Panteha.
okay. I think that's it. I think people are going to start leaving the meeting, and, you know, I'll say bye to everyone virtually. You can start leaving the meeting room. I'm probably just going to sit here with my video on, but thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, everyone in person, for coming, for broaching the world with your masks on. I really appreciate it. And there's postcards there, so take one of each, or one or the other, or none. You don't have to take one if you don't want. But thank you. Yeah, thank you, guys.